Hola, buenas tardes David, Grace, Nick, Jorge, Leonel, María Rosario, bienvenidos, Ana María, bienvenidos al panel 3. Estamos esperando algunos minutos que se integren la gran cantidad de personas que se han inscrito a este panel. Hola Grace, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a este tercer panel sobre evaluación, autorregulación y corregulación para el aprendizaje profundo. Vamos a esperar que se integren las personas y vamos después a dar la bienvenida. Hola, buenas tardes Antonio. Buenas tardes Blanca. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Estamos esperando unos minutos que se integren todas las personas, dándole tiempo a que se integren todas las personas. Bien, buenas tardes, buenos días para quienes están en otro horario. Quiero contarles que estamos esperando unos minutos para comenzar. Tenemos muchos inscritos al panel de hoy. Les quiero recordar un poco cómo funciona el sistema de traducción. Entonces quiero que recuerden que en el panel que está abajo, al final de la pantalla, ustedes van a encontrar un icono que es una forma de globo terráqueo. Ustedes lo aprietan y cliquean el lenguaje en que quieren escuchar. Si quieren escuchar todo en español, español. Si quieren escuchar todo en inglés, inglés. ¿Ya? Y eso va a ser independiente del idioma en que los expositores hablen. ¿Ya? Estoy esperando que se sumen las personas. Quiero darles a todos la más cordial bienvenida y agradecerles que estén acá hoy día. Vamos a esperar un par de minutos más y vamos a comenzar. Vuelvo a saludarlos, buenas tardes, buenos días, para que según el horario que corresponda. Estamos ya prontos a iniciar el panel 3 sobre evaluación, autorregulación y corregulación para el aprendizaje profundo. Todavía faltan unos minutos para iniciar, porque estamos esperando que se incorporen todas las personas, o la mayor parte de las personas que estaban inscritas, y les doy una gran bienvenida. Y les recuerdo cómo funciona el tema del audio. Si ustedes quieren escuchar en español sus presentaciones, tienen que apretar en la barra de herramientas final el icono del globo terráqueo y poner Spanish, español. Y si lo quieren escuchar en inglés, durante todo el evento, tienen que poner el icono sobre inglés, ¿ya? En el chat, como ahí acaba de poner Alexandra, ustedes pueden, que es la persona que ustedes muchas veces le escriben por alguna duda, pueden hacernos todas las preguntas por el chat si tienen alguna dificultad técnica. Y recuerden que todas las preguntas sobre el evento en particular, para los panelistas, que vamos a retomar al final de las presentaciones, se hacen en el icono, Question and Answers. Bien. Bueno, aquí ya veo que hay bastantes participantes: Alejandra, Ana María, Ana, dos Ana María, Antonio, Blanca, veo a Carlos, Carola Bruna, que también es colaboradora nuestra, Cecilia, Constanza, Cristian, David o David, Ed, que es uno de los panelistas que viene otro día, Fernanda, Francisco, Gloria, Grace, Jocelyn, Jorge, Kay, que también es otra panelista nuestra de otros días, Carrie, Lady, Leonel, Lida, que ya aparece un apellido, Lili, Macarena, María Francisca, María Rosario, María Vera, otra María, Mario Reyes, Patricia Tibó, que es colaboradora nuestra, Sandra Cepeda, profesora también de uno de los magísteres de la UDD, Sebastián, Tina, Úrsula, Verónica, alguien de apellido Shu, Osu, Yasna. Bien, y vamos a comenzar en honor al tiempo. Bien, entonces, muy buenas tardes y buenos días según los horarios que correspondan a todos y todas los asistentes y también a nuestros panelistas. Mi nombre es Verónica Villarroel, soy directora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación, y a nombre de la Facultad de Psicología de la Universidad del Desarrollo en Chile, quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida al segundo encuentro internacional virtual en enseñanza, aprendizaje y evaluación en educación superior. Hoy es nuestro tercer día de transmisión de esta actividad que vamos a realizar durante toda la semana y la semana siguiente. Antes de comenzar, quisiera darles algunas indicaciones respecto a la traducción simultánea de este evento. Esto que les contaré también está escrito en el chat, así que lo voy a leer para que ustedes, a los que aún puedan tener dudas, puedan hacerlo adecuadamente. Para seleccionar la interpretación simultánea, deben seleccionar el icono del globo terráqueo que van a encontrar en la barra inferior de su panel Zoom. Al pinchar, deben seleccionar el idioma en el que quieren escuchar toda la actividad, sin importar en qué idioma hable el expositor. Vamos a estar pendientes al chat por cualquier problema o ayuda que necesiten. Entonces, Los invitamos a participar también en esta actividad realizando sus preguntas a lo largo de esta exposición en la sección de preguntas y respuestas, que está en la barra inferior del Zoom como Q&A. Les pedimos que el chat lo usen solo en caso de problemas técnicos que nos quieran informar. Les comento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de la Universidad UDD TV, udd.cl, y que durante los últimos días estaremos poniendo el video y los PowerPoints a de todos los paneles en nuestra página web. Esperamos que hoy la tecnología y las conexiones nos acompañen, pero les pedimos consideración si es que hubiese algún problema técnico durante esta charla. Comentarles también que tras la presentación va a estar todo disponible en nuestra página web. Agradecemos a todos los inscritos interesados en participar y los invitamos a informarse siempre de nuestras actividades en la web de psicología.udd.cl y en nuestras redes sociales @psicologiaudd. Va a iniciar su ponencia la investigadora doctora Carol Evans con su presentación titulada Apoyar la autorregulación de la evaluación por parte de los estudiantes, un enfoque de agencia. La doctora Carol Evans es una líder mundial en la investigación de prácticas de evaluación y pedagogía. Ha sido presidenta de educación superior en la Universidad de Southampton durante los últimos 4 años, donde diseñó y dirigió la exitosa investigación sobre estrategias de prácticas de evaluación, la que fue reconocida a nivel nacional con un premio Advance en educación superior, un premio colaborativo a la excelencia en la enseñanza. La doctora Evans ocupó anteriormente cargos en la Universidad de Exeter, Instituto de Educación, el Decanato de KSS en Londres y la Universidad de Durham, todos siguiendo una carrera de gran éxito en la educación secundaria. Carol además es miembro nacional de enseñanza y miembro principal de Advance en educación superior, Reino Unido. También es oficial de publicaciones del Comité de Becarios Nacionales de Enseñanza y vicepresidente de la Federación Internacional de Becarios Nacionales de Enseñanza del Reino Unido. Le damos a Karen la más cordial bienvenida y puedes comenzar.
So I will begin and I'll say, welcome everyone. I'm just going to give a check to Veronica to say, can you hear me, Veronica?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So thank you very much to everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I'm going to take you through an approach that I developed around to enhance students' engagement with assessment and self-regulation. All the resources are available. I will try and be as clear as possible. If there are things that you don't understand, please do contact me and I will elaborate. So what I'm going to talk you through is I'm going to talk about some key constructs around what do we mean by self-regulation, because we use the term loosely and broadly, and are we all talking about the same thing? I'm then going to talk about some underpinning principles of the work that I've been doing with colleagues across the globe. I'll give you a little bit of background into how the EAT framework developed. I'll then talk about some of the key insights we've got from using that with thousands of students and across many different universities. And then I'll come back at the end to talk about some of the key issues in trying to develop self-regulation. So I hope that gives you a framework around which I'm going to speak today. So the EAT framework, as I've put there, is a model that helps everybody think about how all the different bits of assessment are actually joined together. Often people look at one aspect of assessment and they think a problem is in one place, when actually the problem often lies elsewhere. So I was trying to say, could we look at assessment in an integrated way and look at all of the bits making up the whole? Because if something is wrong with one of those, there are problems throughout everything we do. So that's the kind of basis about this notion of everything impacts everything else, and we need to think about things very holistically. if I move forward, the premise of my work is very much, how do we get students to be co-owners of assessment? This is quite a difficult territory in terms of students' beliefs about how much they should be involved when they come into higher education. And also from a lecturer's point of view, to what extent do we let students in to our thinking? To what extent do we invite them in to partner with us within the curriculum? But my argument is, unless we invite them centrally in, we won't get the engagement that we need. And I was trying to align it with the situation in Chile and the principles underpinning the development of higher education, which are also around that notion of autonomy, inclusion, key absolute principles, but do we live them in reality is a question. If I was trying to summarize the key constructs that I'm going to talk about now, they would be very much around things like, I called it agentic engagement, which is really about the extent to which individuals take control of their learning environment and actually change it. So can I change my learning environment to make it more conducive to me? And what I found with working with failing doctors in medicine was that the strongest doctors were the ones that could read context and manage to get support even when it wasn't freely available. What skill sets did they have that we could capture in this? On the self-regulation side, I'm going to talk about that in a second, about the extent to which we understand how we go about doing things, and is understanding how we go about doing things enough? Because I might understand why I'm not presenting well, but I might not be able to change it in the moment because of the stress of the situation and lots of other things that come into play. So that's something for us to think about. The other one is around assessment literacy, and I'm using that broadly to say, do I understand what I'm required to do? And do I understand the needs of the context I'm working in, the people I'm working with in that moment? So some things don't translate to other contexts as easily as we might hope they would do because of all the different things that are going on in the environment and in our own heads at that time. So here I come up to this screen to talk about engagement. To me is a prerequisite for self-regulation. If we're not engaging centrally in what we're doing, how can we mobilize those skill sets that we need? But it's a massive problem. In my own country, in the UK, I've just come back from working in Australia, the situation wasn't that different there, was the notion that to what extent do young students coming into university at 18, 19, to what extent do they feel able to contribute and be active in their learning? And what is their belief about the role of the teacher? Am I still there to give, or are they willing to be engaged in dialogue? And a lot of students, my latest piece of work, 40% of students lack the confidence to engage in a dialogue with academics. It's not surprising. But at the same token, having worked with many educators, lecturers, academics do not have the confidence to necessarily engage in the types of dialogue that we would like to see in terms of developing student self-regulatory skills. So we have to start with actually building lecturer confidence in that notion of dialogue around education, around assessment. So I've mentioned some of those things there about my beliefs about what learning and teaching should look like. And from a lecturer perspective, another common theme that we've encountered is my belief in my ability to change a system that I'm part of. And many lecturers don't feel autonomous. They don't feel agentic. So if they don't feel agentic, how can we expect them to modify their learning environment to make students more agentic in those learning environments? So I think that's a very important one to think about. I will move on and just move that forward to look at, if I was looking at engagement, I would combine engagement with self-regulation. So I've put there, it's my ability to manage my own learning and adapt it to address what I need to do. But I've also put there, it involves metacognitive, cognitive, and affective aspects of self-regulation. And I've put there, it's also about the accurate deployment of them. And I'm just putting in that adjoiner at the bottom there. Yes, it's to meet task requirements, but it might also be to protect myself. So if I'm feeling under threat, protecting my self-worth may be more important than achieving the goals of a task. And that's something that we're finding is very common with young students coming into university about the need to protect their self-worth when they feel threatened that it's too much or it's too difficult. One big question that we're all asking ourselves at the moment is, what is it to actually think in a deep level within our own discipline? And one thing we've found from the research is that academics within the same discipline, in the same module or unit or course or program, may have very different beliefs about the high-level skills we want students to acquire. And so my point here is, if we can't agree on what those high-level skills and knowledge bases are, how are students supposed to grasp that? So I've put there, looking at Velda McCune and Noel Entwistle's work, they looked at students' ability to understand, their ability to read a context, and their willingness to adopt deep approaches, but also being willing to share. And another increasing problem we see in higher education, in my own context, is students coming into universities being quite mute. Mute in terms of not wanting to talk, not wanting to show their camera in an online session, wanting to hide to, again, protect that sense of self. So how do we give students the confidence to come in to a learning environment? The important and the sexy part of all of this is very much around that if we support students in developing these key strategies, we can enable students from all backgrounds to do well, because the evidence-based Schneider and Prekel's meta-analysis, where they looked at variables impacting how students in higher education did, demonstrated the power of some of these strategies in leveling the playing field. So enabling those from poorer backgrounds to do as well as those from wealthier ones, and also students from ethnic minorities to do as well as Indigenous populations. So there is a good reason why we are all talking about this. And there is, as I said, I've got colleagues here today who are doing excellent work in that space. I actually wanted to look at students who are most successful in professional practice. So I studied these across teaching and across medicine to look at what were the characteristics of those that regulated very well. They wanted to understand for themselves. They very much were very good at noticing things. Resilience is used a lot by people to talk about persistence. I would like to stress being adaptable and giving up, knowing when to give up, knowing when to walk away, very, very important skill. And also being very proactive in getting the environment to work for them. So there are certain dispositions that individuals who are successful have, and we know that, and they also align very closely to those fourth industrial age skills that the future of work have been talking about for the last 10 years and have become even more paramount as a consequence of COVID. I've mentioned the word once, I won't mention it again. Sorry. So as I said, self-regulation, people use it in different ways. So what are we talking about? So is it about how I process information? Is it about understanding why I process information in a certain way? Is it about how I manage my emotions? Well, I would argue it's about all three, but I will also argue very heavily that the affective domain, the emotional side, is the glue. And without that, the other bits kind of fall apart, which is something why self-efficacy is so important, my belief in my ability to do well in this particular context. So again, some people use self-regulation as talking about a process, so a specific task, so how I plan a task, what I do in the moment, how I monitor my progress, and how I do at the end of the day. That's one model, it's a process. Others talk about it, as I said, in terms of the cognitive, metacognitive, and affective. Others look at the constructs that are most impacted by learning, such as self-efficacy, the goal that students are actually aiming to get and what they're satisfied with, absolutely fundamental in affecting outcomes. Their beliefs about learning in the first place. And also self-regulation can be shared, or it can be very individual. So we could have a team regulation, very much shared, co-constructed place to get to. If I do a nod to an American, Daniel Dinsmore in the United States, he talks a lot about, well, we need to focus on the really high level things. So it's about using strategies, using the right strategy and using the right strategy well. And an awful lot of work has actually said that students often use the wrong cues to inform their learning. They often use the wrong strategies and they waste an awful lot of time. And a lot of work has recently talked about that we don't spend enough time thinking about goals and whether a student's goals are on the same page as our goals. And that's really where we should be starting. So we need to go back and actually check, what are their goals? What are they aiming to do? And are they aligned with what we want them to do? So that means clearer signposting. In moving on, I'm just going to now move from talking about those constructs. I'm going to take a breath. So sorry if that was a bit fast. Take a breath, and I'm now going to talk about the framework and where it came from and how you can use it. So it's underpinned by notions of equity, agency, and transparency, hence its name. And it's very much about inclusivity. We have used it to level the playing field, and by using it, we've managed to eradicate social class and ethnic minority differential learning outcomes. So we know it's powerful. And it's around engaging students actively in their learning. So those are the beliefs that underpin it. I think they speak for themselves, but do ask me about them if they don't make sense to you in the chat. The work stems from a piece of work that I did following. The first piece of work was around EAT. There's about 5 different versions of this framework now, different versions for different countries, and different lengths because different tools have been developed by different people. It originated from a piece of work I did back in 2013, where I analysed around 460 papers on assessment feedback. I've continued to that systematic review since 2013. And so I've now reviewed around 50,000 academic papers and graded those papers according to the quality of the methodology and the quality of the outputs across all disciplines. So from that, I was able to derive constructs of effective assessment and feedback practice. I feel I've saturated those constructs because after all that work, I cannot find any more constructs. And I've used it obviously in practice. Well, I have used it in practice since 2016. So it's been used across disciplines, adapted. So the joy of it is you can adapt it to your own discipline, to your own specific group of students, and it can be used individually, or as a team, or as an institution. I'm just giving you the links to show you how to get there. I'm not going to spend time on this, but I'm giving you the breadcrumbs to get there if you want to go and have a look. Those are the different versions of the framework, and there are links there so you can easily access things. So Royce is coming on after me to talk about self-regulation, and he will argue very much, I expect, about how students internalize, how do they understand for themselves? So the argument is in assessment, it's not about telling, it's about providing the opportunities for students to understand what quality is for themselves. So in using the EAT framework, it very much allows you to think about what areas do you do well in assessment, what areas do you do less well, and students and academics can use the framework. I didn't develop it as a psychometric tool. I developed it as a conceptual framework, but we have found it has 2 underpinning factors. One is around assessment literacy, and one surprisingly is around engagement. And we did find links with how students perceive their engagement and how they did academically. So we're now refining that measurement part of the tool because it is quite sexy that you actually can predict how students are going to do by their perception of their engagement in assessment. So moving on to that, take a deep breath. Here is the framework. Here is a lecture version of the framework, and it's 12 areas. They're all interconnected around assessment literacy, around assessment feedback, and around assessment design. You can grade that on 1. 1 means I haven't got out of bed, means pretty insignificant, the work I do in this space. And 5 means we're brilliant at this. This works really well. And I'm just going to pick out a few things as I go round this wheel and demonstrate some of those high-level self-regulatory and engagement aspects that we found that have been very important. First of all, I'll mention the point about how everything is interrelated. So if you look at AL1, clarifying what's good. If I don't have any conception about what good is, how can I, in AF4 at the other opposite corner, how can I evaluate how well I've done if I have no conception of quality in the first place? Now, we did find a few students that could do that, but they were rare. They were very rare indeed. And all I'm going to mention really around, I'm not going to go around to each one individually. I'm just going to kind of group them and say, in assessment literacy, the main things that make a difference to how students do is working with students to co-construct criteria, assessment criteria, and at the task level. And that means it's not about giving students criteria. We interviewed students a year into their studies at the end of their first year, and many of them had no idea what the criteria meant. But we also found many academics that didn't understand what the assessment criteria meant. So the argument is, how do you work with students in an ongoing fashion to enable them to get an understanding of what that is? And one of the high value items is getting students to mark and moderate work from the beginning, from the get-go, and giving them lots of opportunities to do that. And the important part of that is getting them to do it firstly without criteria. Think about that. They've got to generate the criteria themselves, and then with the criteria. So opportunities to do that are really important. The other ones that we've asked people to look at is, how do you signpost in your unit, your module, your course? What are the key high-level skills you want students to develop? How are those clear to students? That those are the absolute vital things that you are agreed on in that particular course you're teaching that they need to master. So how do we make those more transparent? I'd put there about the requirements of the discipline. And again, it's how are we engaging students in the research we're doing, and how are we unpacking how we think? I asked colleagues to say, what is it to work deeply in your discipline? What would it look like to me? How would I know I was doing it? What's the language underneath things? So it really is around getting students to be able to see things from the inside out. So why are we doing this? What's the rationale? So why am I asking you to do this and use hours of your time? What's the purpose of doing this? Why am I asking you to do that? So basically it's exposing the rationale very clearly with students. And what we find when we do that is often maybe we don't necessarily understand everything as much as we might. And also, how do things connect from one task to another? Because my most strategic students will say, I need to see the connections in order to see whether this is worth my time. How does this link? And again, one thing we found very powerful was actually with staff and students, was actually linking across a whole program, what was going on at different points and how did it connect? And did lecturers understand that or not? If I go to the next 4 and look at feedback, we need to move to that notion that feedback isn't something students receive per se. Okay? Feedback is any source of information that the student draws on to help their learning. Much of that is internal to them. It's not about solely feedback from us. From a cognitive perspective, I would say we need to really shortcut feedback and make it really simple, because many students lose the messages when it's too long. So what was good, what let you down, how to improve. But how can we give students multiple opportunities to give feedback to others, to use feedback? And again, one of the reasons why peer feedback is one of the most powerful things impacting how students do in the Schneider and Prekel analysis is because every time I look at somebody else's work, I'm calibrating in my brain where my work sits in comparison to theirs. Think about your own academic work. We're constantly making judgments of our work against somebody else's. So giving students those multiple acts, not just one off, throughout of how to do that is incredibly powerful in impacting how they do. And self-evaluation is one of the most difficult things, but it's also the El Dorado of where we want to go to. If I can judge the quality of my own work for myself, I don't need you. I'm flying, I'm away. So it's how do we enable students to develop those skills by giving them lots of opportunities to test their understanding, to check things. And it could be students producing questions for each other. It will also about providing them with exemplars of very good work. How do we demonstrate to them what it really looks like? Moving on quickly, I will go and just grab onto those assessment design items and again say, what does it allow students to go to the higher levels of that? One of the key things is understanding what the rules and processes are. Again, if I ask students in the UK how their work is moderated, how their final work is arrived at, most of them will say they haven't got a clue. Quite a lot of lecturers will also say they don't actually understand the algorithms used to moderate and mark work. Again, I argue students need to be doing moderating and marking, and they need to be part of that process centrally. Again, if we want students to step up and we don't require them to use high-level skills, if they're clever, why would they use them? So what I'm saying there is the tasks we set need to require them to go up high. So I am thinking about those authentic opportunities where we move away from a piece of assessment for a piece of assessment's sake. Yes, it's important to know what standard they're at, but to me, assessment needs to do much more. So how can what they're doing contribute to society? How can it help take their careers forward? So a student writing an essay for me has value, yes, but a student actually producing a response to an issue within a local community as part of that response is more valuable because they're solution finding, they're producing useful products. So how can assessment feed forward in terms of its value? So how can it have greater value and how can students have greater ownership? And a lot of work in this space talks about how do we get progression in students' assessment work so we can see the value of what they've learned and also the power of knowing what you don't know and that it's not a negative thing, that the more I know, the less I know. So how are we enabling them to progressively develop the skill sets that they're going to need? And linked with that, one of the easiest things I've ever done that I found has been incredibly successful across universities is actually giving students links to good resources. It sounds very simple, but it levels the playing field. So, for example, cutting a lecture short by 10 to 15 minutes, providing them a link to good networks of support and also to good resources means they're actually mining information in the right place. They're actually in the right library, so they can think more deeply. Quite often, a lot of students are using resources that are non-suitable to start with, and so they're mining in the dark. So it's basically, how do we lead them to doing that? And again, the other powerful one is how do we engage students in teaching so that we're evaluating every session we have with them? Can we move away from end of module, mid-module evaluations, they're valuable, but they're not valuable in that moment. So how do students take the lead on what have I understood, what I've not understood? How do they then follow on in the next session? So it's an ongoing dialogue. So we come back to that dialogic state. So I'm saying, if you take all of these activities in this wheel and you say, okay, so what's the high level action that makes a difference? So I am talking about high impact pedagogies. So what actually changes the way things work? In moving forward, here is the student version. And again, we often ask our students to rate themselves at the beginning and towards the end. They also, to what extent did they feel they were allowed to engage in assessment? An area where they regularly come down on is their willingness to engage in peer activities, which is quite interesting, and preparation for doing so. And again, all of the issues around that, which I could spend hours on talking about effective ways of engaging peers and non-effective ways. Another time, perhaps, I'd love to. But anyway, I've just summarized some of those in the next 3 slides because I was talking quite quickly. So I've just summarized a few ideas from each of those areas of assessment literacy, assessment feedback, and assessment design. So designing with and not for, explaining what's going on underneath the surface, giving students access to networks, and it's being very explicit about what we're trying to do and how we're thinking. On the assessment feedback one, as I've said, simplifying and focusing on students on what they can do to improve their understanding throughout. I'll come back to that one in a minute. It's a really important one. Talked about effective and being authentic, relating to real world context and valuable outcomes. Challenging students to be able to adapt, translate ideas. But that importance, that one's gone a bit weird, sorry about that one, about developing, which is quite ironic, so I shall laugh, developing clear route maps. So spotlighting, shining a light, and getting students to help do that. Having gone through a course, when I finished, getting the students to go back and identify where were the blocks, what were the conceptual ideas I really couldn't handle, what would have been helpful at that point if I was doing that again. Absolutely a totally valuable activity to do with students, to say, where did you come undone? What could we have done better to have enabled you to have better access? What were, we call it rate limiting steps, the things that stopped you from being successful? And were they same for all students, or was it particular groups of students that had that problem? How can we use data with students to show the impact of working in different ways and how it impacts outcomes? Because our students regulated in very, very different ways with similar and different outcomes. So there's no one route through, as you all will know. So if I was finishing off and trying to pull this together, in trying to develop these metacognitive capacities of that accurate analysis of what you're required to do and being able to manage your learning, how can it be interwoven throughout every aspect of assessment? So if I go back down to the route map concept of, I need to see it if I'm going to try and emulate it. So we can tell students to be more critical. We can tell students to be more reflexive. But what does that actually mean if I've never done that before? So I need the opportunity to see. And I need to see variations of it, because there's never one way of doing it. So I need to see it, and I need lots of opportunities to do that. So I need lots of examples. I also need opportunities to try and test that in an environment where I feel safe. So low stakes. So how can I test whether I've got that idea? Can I copy it? But then to what extent do we prompt students and challenge them to take the idea and adapt it and develop it? And does assessment enable students to do that? Or does it promote replication of knowledge? rather than the creative translation of it. And to what extent do we encourage that in schools coming into higher education? And then to what extent do we give students the opportunities to translate it across different contexts? So I'll give you one example where students are given rubrics, assessment guidance documents, people call them different names. Often students who regulate badly will take a rubric from one module or course and try and use the same one for the next course, because they've never developed those skill sets to be able to dissect what's being required and how to use those skills productively in another environment. If I pull that together, what I think we all need to be thinking about is, what are the discipline-specific self-regulatory skills that we need to identify and signpost? So, for example, I can quote a very successful example where a course was looking at history, and they were looking at the skills that students learn in high school and what they needed for the first year of their degree. And they identified the gaps, the skills gaps. And they focused that first year in addressing those skills gaps. In science, in another module that I witnessed amazing things, they were looking at students on field trips, and they were looking at the skills that they were least able to master when they were actually doing work in the field. And they focused students' attention on that. And their results went through the roof. So how do we identify what are those threshold, those concepts that are really high level, and how do we cut back the curriculum, streamline it to focus on those things that really matter to us? So that requires us to be quite disciplined. And then that question I would ask all people would be, what does a deep approach look like in your particular module, your discipline? What do students need to aspire to? How can they see evidence of it all around them as to what that is? And how, from the beginning of a course to the end of the program, do you progressively develop those skills from the beginning? So I often see a research element at the end of a degree, like a dissertation project. But how is that being developed in year one? So how is my student a researcher from the moment they've walked into a university? How is a PhD student not just doing their PhD, but a full member, paid up member of the academic community, whereby they're having to engage in the cultural, political, social capital that's going on all around them, because that's probably going to help them more than just focusing narrowly on their thesis. And then how are we ensuring that what we're assessing is at the challenging level it needs to be in terms of what the students produce, and how is it valuable to them and to wider society? And how are we using data with students, I suppose, is a very big question around how we're using data to demonstrate the process of learning with them, so that they can see the consequences of working in a certain way and the outcomes for them of that. Again, it's incredibly powerful. And again, it's identifying where the problem is. There was a lovely study many years ago by a colleague called Crowell and colleagues in the States. And his basic argument, the argument of the paper there, was that many students from poorer backgrounds came into university, often left earlier. The retention of students was low. And so what he did was, I'd say he, the team, what they did was they actually designed assessment whereby the students had to teach a member of their family or their community that particular knowledge, skills base. And they brought the family members in to have conversations as part of the assessment. Well, obviously that could be done online. But the point was, it was covering lots of bases. One, it was, can I actually translate a really complex concept in science to a level that a lay person can understand it? Because if I can do that, I've understood it. But also it was bringing in that notion of belonging and bringing in the community of the student into a university environment in terms of connecting, because the student was isolated. And one of my last points on that self-regulation point a lot of efforts are made to say we need to find role models of a similar type to me or you, because that will make me feel better, that I can achieve. But if I really want to move into a different world and I want to acquire skill sets that I don't have, you need to test me and put me in a community that I don't normally associate with. So that will enable me to access the social and cultural capital of a group that I previously didn't have access to. So I need to go across boundaries as well as see the beauty within a particular network. And just finishing off, I've just put a few articles up here that there are links to that you can go to. We tried to summarize all the variables that impacted assessment of feedback, looking at the individual and looking at the environment. And they're summarized in this article that's free online if you wanted to look at it. And there's also this one that I did with colleagues across Europe through the European Universities Association, which looks at if you were trying to use the framework at an institutional level, how could you do that? And we worked with about 10 universities to look at how we might do that. If you want to know more about the framework and adapting it, we're currently working with colleagues in Spain at Zaragoza and also at Minho in Portugal, and looking at a whole sequence of self-regulation tools. We produced a framework around self-regulation and assessment that unpicks everything as a step-by-step guide, and a list of resources that are around self-regulation on its own, but connected to the framework. So if any of you want to have that information or want to be involved in developing the EAT survey tool further, you're very welcome to be involved. All of the resources can be adapted because they have a Creative Commons license. So you can change the language, you can change the words on the templates to focus in on a specific issue. I'm going to stop there to allow the transition over to Royce, who is one of my idols. Sorry, Royce, to embarrass you before you start, but a lot of my inspiration has come from Royce Sadler, and I'm not afraid to say so. So an incredible, amazing man who's done some of the most important work in assessment and feedback to my knowledge. So I look forward to hearing from Royce now. So thank you, and I'll stop sharing.
Muchas gracias, Carol, por tu presentación muy completa, muy interesante. Nos quedan muchas ideas dando vuelta. Así que muy generosa tu presentación en cuanto a los conocimientos que nos entregas. Ahora vamos a presentar la ponencia del Dr. Roy Sadler, titulada Cómo los estudiantes pueden aprender a monitorear y controlar la calidad de sus respuestas. El Dr. Roy Sadler es profesor honorario del Instituto de Innovación en Enseñanza y Aprendizaje de la Universidad de Queensland. Es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Griffith, Australia. Desde 1973 su docencia e investigación se han centrado en la evaluación formativa y sumativa del aprendizaje de los estudiantes. En los últimos 20 años, la evaluación en educación superior ha sido su principal interés. Ha publicado muchos artículos en revistas internacionales de alto prestigio sobre criterios, calificaciones, estándares de rendimiento académico, garantía de calidad y el papel de la evaluación en la mejora del aprendizaje. Es un académico e investigador destacado y reconocido en su área, tal como nos contaba Carol, por lo que es un honor para nosotros contar con su presencia en este evento. El Dr. Sadler no ocupa PowerPoint, por lo que será una exposición hablada. Bienvenido, Royce, un gusto tenerte acá y puedes comenzar.
Thank you. It's very good to be here. One of the things that's always interested me is why, when I tell students or give them feedback, why they don't learn and pick that up. And I started my teaching career in 1965, which is before some of you were born. And all the time I've taught, I've had this problem. How do we get students to actually produce work consistently well? And in the title of this address today, I've used the word monitoring and control. We really need to get students to the point where they are independent of us to a large degree. Learning is to basically teach them the skills to be themselves and to be independent of us, not to keep depending on us. And when I'm particularly interested in a situation where students write what I call the extended responses, these are often in prose. They'll be assignments or term papers. Sometimes they're responses to examination questions that might take them a page, half a page, 2 pages, something like that. And I also include mathematics in that as well. I used to teach mathematics. And one time when I was in Norway, there was a professor who said to me, you know, what you say is not really relevant to me because you seem to be talking about essays all the time. Whereas what I'm a mathematician and all my students do is mathematics. And I said to him, do all of your students get everything right or wrong all the time? He said, of course not. I said, do you give students part marks for things that are substantially right or partly right? And yeah, of course I did all the time. I said, do you put commas at the ends of parts of your sentences and full stops at the end? He said, no, but I know the textbooks do that. I said, your students are writing essays in mathematics. If they're solving a problem, they're writing an essay in mathematics. So there is a logical connection between one part and the other. At that point, he settled down. At the end, he came to me and said, that was so good. I really found that very interesting, what you're talking about. And what I was talking about is what goes on in students' minds when they're trying to respond to the tasks we give them. Now, I don't mind whether you call them as tasks or items or challenges or questions, whatever. The thing is that students have to produce extended responses. They've got to write continuous prose. I make that point because there's certain things that happen in our brains when we're doing that don't happen when we are recognising somebody else's ideas on what might be correct or incorrect problems, such as you get with multiple choice questions or many of the other types like that. When we produce a piece of high quality, we're looking at 2 things. We're looking at the content of it and we're looking at how well it is expressed. And those are the 2 things that go together. You can't explain the content unless you explain it well, if you want someone to believe that you know what you're talking about. The way we express it is very important. And one of the things that Derek Bock, who wrote the book about underachieving colleges and universities in the US, he said, we want our students to be able to write with precision and grace. And I think they're beautiful words. We want them to say exactly what they think the situation is and to be correct in what they say and to do it in a way which actually leads the reader's mind into understanding what was going on in the student's mind. So it is a communication. It's not just answering questions. Now, producing and recognising are quite different skills. There are lots of areas of ordinary life where people can distinguish, make fine distinctions too, between items of the same class but of different quality. And yet those same people cannot produce high quality things at all. I've been in places where people have said to me, I understand what you're saying. I've even given lectures on how to do this. But when I come to do it myself, it's very hard. I said, what sort of thing? She said, well, writing a journal article. She said, I know all that you probably know in terms of giving a course on writing journal articles. And she said, I've even done it myself with students at Western Sydney University. But when I come to write them myself, it's about 100 times more difficult than what I thought it would be. All the stuff in your mind has to come together as you construct something. Now, those are the parts of your brain that requires the parts of your brain that are way more than should be recognising. If you have a look at many exam questions in many of the professions, they're multiple choice items and questions like, which of these is the best of the responses here? Now, the creation of those responses, actually it's hard to create responses to those sorts of items, but all of those are constructed by somebody else. And all the student has to do is recognise which one is the best. They don't even have to explain why they choose it. Now, that seems to me to be a fault in a lot of our assessment, especially in the professions, that I think is a bad thing. In my own writing, I think people would be surprised how long it takes me to write a paragraph. And very often I start with what I think is a crystal clear idea. Then I try to convert that into prose that someone else will read and understand and appreciate, and they will understand what I think I understand. And as I write, I find, no, that's not quite right. And so I push the words around, and sometimes I have written, up to 20 versions of a paragraph before I get it clear. In the process, I am teaching myself. And I realize that the process of editing and editing and editing the words on the page, that process is the same as my learning what the connections are. And so getting students to write extended works and to edit their works until they are as crystal clear or as precise and as graceful as Derek Bock would like is a real task. And I want more students to be able to do that and to do it with confidence. Ian Forster, who was a famous writer, he wrote a book called Aspects of the Novel. And in that he said, how can I tell what I think until I see what I say? The process of externalizing something, either in spoken words, which is a pretty transitory thing, and we don't usually edit our sentences live. If we find someone raises their eyebrows and doesn't understand, we simply try to clarify it on the spot. But when you write things down, you've got a physical representation of what's in your mind. And then working on that until it is precise and says exactly what you say is what clarifies it for yourself. And that's why I think written work for our students in universities is extremely important. And extended responses are the best way, not only to help students learn, but to find out how much they have learned. One of the puzzles that I used to have when I was teaching, I still do, is why don't students take note of feedback? Now, there's lots and lots of reasons why they don't. Very often we give them feedback on one piece of work and they won't actually get that same piece of work the next time. It'll be different. So many students assume that what I was told about the last piece of work and its faults and failings, they want to carry over to the new one because it's on a different topic altogether. But what we really want when we give feedback is we want students to improve and to learn from us as experts about how to fix their mistakes. Now, I want to talk today about a different way of doing that than feedback, because I think feedback is, its return on investment is much smaller than other ways of doing it. And there's a different way to help them improve. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, in the title, I said how students can learn to monitor and control the quality of their responses to assessment tasks. They've got to monitor what they're doing, when they're doing it, because that's when it matters. And they have to be pretty quality alert so they know what they're doing. Now, by monitor, some people, monitor has quite a few different meanings, but this is what I mean. By constantly observing how the work is coming together so that its final state is the best the student can produce. On the other hand, control, monitoring and control. The control is knowing which and when to make changes for the better. It's noticing things that could be done better and then making them better. So monitoring is keeping an eye on the control. Keeping an eye on the quality as it's being produced. That's when it matters, not after when students can make judgments about people's work. I'm interested in what goes on in students' brains at the time they're producing, because in real life, that's when it matters, because then you can produce, we've got a higher probability of producing consistently good work. Now, when students start off constructing something that is an extended response, they usually start with some sort of goal knowledge. and it is some idea of what they're trying to say. Now, I'm not talking about stuff that's just factually correct or incorrect. I'm talking about thinking and reasoning and making an argument and presenting that argument and expecting that other people read that argument and expect to be convinced. That sort of extended response. Now, the student should have some idea of where they're heading, but it doesn't have to be fixed. In my experience, this is my own experience in writing, I find that where I thought I was heading is not where I end up, and I'm not worried about it, because in the process of developing my thought and reasoning, I teach myself more. I get a better understanding, a fuller understanding, and I want to be able to figure out how can I get students to make that routine so that they can do the same. Let me give you my definition of what goal knowledge is. It's the ability to keep a dynamic image of the high quality piece in mind, separate from the work being produced. So you've got an idea of what it could be and should be, and you're working down here, and it's a long way from where that is. But as you produce the work yourself, that image is changing. That's why I call it a dynamic image, so that the work in progress and the image can be compared. If you don't have any idea of if you don't have any kind of image at all, you're just sort of like lost, you're just sort of playing around in the mud. But you need some kind of image. Now, the image has to be dynamic because it doesn't exist in detailed form until later. When you finished it, then it is in detailed form. And what you have to do is get what is being produced and the image to coincide towards the end of the writing. And that's a difficult thing for a lot of students. What can give them a clearer picture of the image as it forms? One thing is conversation with other people. And sometimes I've said to people, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. I think you do, but you haven't conveyed it to me because I don't know what you're talking about. Now that when students are producing what I call complex works or extended responses, they have to attend to two things at once. They have to attend to the big picture, that is where I'm heading, this image, and they have to attend to the little things that matter. So you've got one agenda is a micro agenda on little things. They can be as simple as patching a sentence, as grammar up, and the other one is the big one, and their minds are flipping backwards and forwards between these two. The lesser important at many points are the small things. You can fix them up after. The bigger ones are, the conceptual one is, what am I trying to convey here? And how can it come together and gel so that when I've finished, it is a coherent, good quality piece of work. The control often means recognizing a change point or an area where something's not quite right. I don't know if you ever experienced this, but I often find when I'm writing that I think, I don't think what I've said is right, but I don't know what is right, because I'm constructing my own knowledge as I go along. Now, students construct knowledge as well. It's not a knowledge that's new to the universe, but it's new for that student. And I think we need to think about our universities as being knowledge farms, where we extend the big body of knowledge that the world has, and we need to extend the knowledge and the depth of knowledge in our students' minds. So I see teaching as much constructing knowledge, but in the students' minds. Now, to the students, that knowledge is new. It's as new as when a researcher discovers something. It's an enlightenment that comes through puzzling over something and working hard at it. I want my students to be better able to do that. It needs to be practiced until it becomes automated and intuitive. So we read something, we say, that's not quite right, but I know what it should be, and we adjust it. There was a writer once called Janet Emig, E-M-I-G, and she talked about how much editing is useful in learning detail and depth. She wrote, I think, in the 1970s or thereabouts, and I have a good friend who seems to know everything, And I said to her, do you know anything about this Janet Emig? And she said, oh, yes. I said, well, I'm really impressed by her work and it seems very relevant, but I never hear anybody talk about it. I found out that her article in the journal that she published it in is the second most cited article in the JSTOR collection. If you know what JSTOR is, you'll know that that's a big thing, but it is widely used now. And if you haven't read it, I suggest you do read it, because we need to teach our students how to edit and how to have the big picture and the small picture simultaneously in their minds so that they can make the changes. They need to learn to notice the things that need to be noticed. They need to skip over the things that are immaterial. And those judgments are pretty fine judgments. If we want students to make consistently high quality responses to our questions, then we have to give them practice at doing that and maybe alert them to what those things are and to actually reassure them that that's what professional researchers and writers do as well. And I like to call that, once it's become automated and intuitive, I call this competence. At one stage in my career, I had a high position at Griffith University, and I remember with the Vice-Chancellor, we had a difficult letter to write, and because it was legal. And we sat down and we spent an hour or so trying to get the wording right. And he said, does it scan? Does it scan? So he read it aloud and said, it's not quite right. This thing is going to get waved around in court. We can't afford for it to be wrong. So we'd scan it, and he just listened to himself read it. And I read my own work aloud so that I hear myself trying to think through things. And I recommended my students, especially my thesis students, do the same. Now, the goal for me in teaching is to make the student as independent of me as I possibly can in the available time. So they have to learn to make good judgments, and they have to internalize that so they can become competent in their own area. And I don't think a person's competent until they can do that. Let me talk a little bit about air conditioning control. Air conditioners have become much more sophisticated recently than what they used to be. But in small places like homes, like where I live, I've got an air conditioning controller, and on the wall there's a little box, and in that box are a few things that aren't normally noticeable by other people. It's got a little cover on it, it's a dial, and it's got some little screen. Let me tell you about air conditioning systems if you don't already know. An air conditioning system is to heat or cool air. You know that. But the way it works is there is a set point. Now that set point is the point at which you want the temperature to be, plus or minus a degree or two. So let's say it's 23. You want it to be 23 degrees Celsius, plus or minus. So it could be as low as 22, as much as 24. Or you might have a bigger tolerance, as low as 20, as high as 26, something like that. But you have a set point, which is your ideal temperature. Inside the little box is a sensor or a thermometer, which actually measures what the temperature is of the air at any given time. So that's one thing, it's a sensor. Then there's another device that compares the sensor and the set point to say how different are they. And if they're different, then something needs to happen. What does happen is that the control device constructs a signal which it sends to the equipment that makes hot and cold air and says, it's too cold in here, makes them hot, or it's too hot in here, makes them cold. That the plant outside is what's usually outside, or houses or in the ceiling or somewhere or other, but it's away because they make a bit of noise. But the thing is that you've got the controller, which doesn't actually make the air change, but it gives instructions to the devices that actually control the airflow. And you've got fans and everything else. Now, that's a good analogy for what we want to do when we want to get students to be automated in terms of their control. You've got a sensor, you've got a set point, you've got a comparator, you've got a signal sensor, a signal sender, which is a little device that sends a bit of digital signal, You've got a digital receiver in the complex that runs the motors and everything, that run the compressor that runs the air control. And then you've got a distributor with a fan. Now, we want our students to be able to have a set point, which is the goal. We want them to be able to compare the state of their work at any time with that goal, and if necessary, modify the goal because it mightn't be refined enough yet. And then to do that themselves. So I want to get that box that's on the wall into the students' heads so they're able to do that. And I can't do that by simply feeding them knowledge. They have to experience what that is so they learn how to do it. Now, I've written that up in one of the book chapters that I've written up. Oh, incidentally, I'm using some talking prompts that I've got here. After this session, I will send these to the organisers, who I'll send exactly the same version as I'm speaking from, and you'll be able to get them as well. Now, just to realise it's not an article, it is a set of prompts. And if you want to know the depth of my thinking, or whatever it is, there's a list of about 8 articles at the end of it, and you can look up any of those. And if you want the information, you can get it from ResearchGate or something like that for nothing. Now, what are the paths to getting people to this state of competence and acting like a little feedback box that controls the whole thing? Well, one of the most common ways is to coach students into doing it. So we give students feedback, and we get them to talk about feedback, and we help them to do that, and we help them to make the changes by scaffolding what we're doing. We've got all these other words, and we give them constant and repeated inputs so that they will learn. Now, I've come to the conclusion that students and people generally don't learn very much by being told, especially told once. If you've got kids, you'll know that your kids don't always learn the first time you tell them. One of the experiences one of my sons had was he was at a swing in a little park when he was young. I suppose he was 5. And the swing was very simple. It had 2 chains hanging from a pipe bar. And at the bottom of these 2 chains was a single board about 50 millimetres thick and about, 400 millimetres long, 200 millimetres wide. And you simply sit on it and have a swing. So my advice was, don't get near that board. And don't jump off when you're out, because you'll fall over. And watch out when other people are using that swing, because if they fall off and the swing comes back and hits you on your head, hits you on the head, you'll know about it. It will hurt. Yes. They all understand this until they get hit once. And then they learn to keep away from the swing with a board because it hurts. I mean, technically, it could knock them out. But that's what we have to do. We have to actually let them experience things. And with kids, sometimes they have to learn the hard way. Now, the problem with coaching people, which is what we call teaching and giving feedback, is that it's very often the coach who has in their mind an image of what the student's work should have been. And it may not have been the same as what the students did. So the coach may be giving advice about how to make their work closer to the coach's image of what it should be. And the student might have had a different image, and that feedback is then confusing. I'm not saying all feedback is confusing by any means, but sometimes I've had the most useful feedback from reviewers of my manuscripts when I've sent them away for publication. They've come back and I see this person understands completely what I'm trying to do, and their advice is just first class. Sometimes people will make comments as if they feel compelled to make comments, and it's just not helpful at all. So it's important that we get ways of helping our students internalise what it means to monitor the quality of it so they can control it. Now, my approach would be different. It's to throw the learners in the deep end. If you don't know that phrase, it means tossing someone who wants to learn to swim, to toss them in the deep end of the pool and they'll figure out a way to get to the edge. And if they don't, you're still standing there waiting to get them out. One of the things that words can't do is convey quality very well. What we need to do is let students see quality of different kinds. There are different kinds of quality, and there are things which are very different, which we would say are of the same quality. Now that is not profound. It's just what the word quality is like. Quality is one of those concepts where it's neither this or that. It's neither high quality or not high quality. It's on a continuum. And we need to get our students to learn the concept of quality. And they'll only learn the concept of quality by seeing a whole range of it. And they'll only learn the concept of quality if they see items of the same quality, but are very different from one another. So they learn to get this two-dimensional idea of what quality looks like, because that's what they have to have in their own image of where they're heading when they're constructing their work. And so I've tried to introduce my students into seeing that two-dimensional space and saying, look, this is what we have to do to actually understand what quality is, because you can't control the quality unless you know what that space is. What's critical is that we give students some examples, multiple examples of the work of the same, of works of the same kind that they are producing themselves, but of different quality. And we don't tell them which one's which. Now, we don't overpower them. Now, one of the things that we can do much more easily now, we can share things on digitally, is we can actually distribute some of these to students. But if we tell students in advance, this is a really good example, you just see how good it is, they know already what the quality judgment is. But if we give them a range of things and say, sort these out, that's a difficult exercise for them. So which ones, say you give them 5 things and say, order them, put them in order from high to low quality. That's a challenge for a lot of students. And they might say, but 3 of these look the same. I didn't say they're random. I just said, well, they are random. There's just 3, there's 5 of them you've got to do. But I didn't say there's one of each. I didn't say they're different. They might all be the same. Just have a look. You tell me what the quality of those is. So we have to get them into that space where there's nothing that's predisposing them to make judgments about it, because we don't give them any clues. And that's what I mean by throwing them in at the deep end. I don't give students any criteria. I don't give them rubrics. I don't provide any guidance. I don't provide any hints. I don't do any pre-sorting. The question is, if they're looking at one piece of work that's in the same genre as the work they're trying to produce, my question is, how good is this piece of work? Just in absolute terms, how good is it? Because I want students to see what is there and not tell them what to look for. When we're giving students feedback, we've got a good idea what to look for. And we can say, well, we've got to get the students to learn what to look for. Well, there's different ways of learning. And one of them is to be in a controlled experience environment where you learn the hard way. So the one thing I'd say to students, have a look at these and tell me what the quality of them is and indicate what you think the quality is. The second question is, explain what you just did. Explain what the quality is. And let students explain it in whatever way they can. Now, one of the things that I've found is that students use different words from what we do. They have a different vocabulary from what we do. What we've tried to do is to force them into our vocabulary. So when we have criteria and rubrics and things like that, we have a vocabulary and we think we know what the vocabulary is. But chances are that my understanding of those same terms is different from yours, different from 5 other teachers. So the student then is trying to figure out whose meanings for the terms shall I be attending to. So now just tell me in your own words. Time will come when they'll start to learn to use words that are more descriptive and have got more of a common meaning, such as coherent or reasoning, things like that. They'll become used to that. But let them express things in their own words, because they will try to find a vocabulary which conveys to us their explanation for why they make the judgments. The third thing is to ask them to give advice to the author as to how it could have been done better. Now, there's some work has been done in the UK to say what happens in students' minds as they try to compose that advice. The answer is that's when students learn things, not by so much by making the judgments, not so much by explaining the judgments, but when they come to convert that into constructing for the other person, giving them advice. I don't use the word feedback. I just say, tell the author how it could have been done better and show them where it could have been done better. And that's a pretty difficult exercise, but some of the research shows that is a very powerful way to learn. What's my finishing time, Veronica? No? Okay. I'll give you just a minute.
Zeros, yes.
The last thing I have found students surprised at is they come to me and they say, this is quite well done, but it's not what they were asked to do. I don't know if you've had this experience, but one time I found that I reckon 40% of my students didn't answer the question I asked them to do, but something else. That is very common. It's important when students discover that for themselves. They say, you asked them to do this, they did that. How can I evaluate how well they did it? Because they didn't do what you asked. So these are the experiences that I think we can get students to have and to learn from when we throw them in at the deep end. So I suggest you go to it, have fun with your students, trust them to have a go. And if there's no marks or anything for this. It's just part of the exercise of learning as they try to monitor and control the quality of what they're doing while they are doing it, because that's when it matters. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Royce, por tu presentación, muy interesante, muy reflexiva, ¿cierto? Así que nos va a dejar algunas preguntas e ideas para poder comentar después. Muchas gracias. Ahora vamos a continuar con la ponencia de la doctora Jacqueline Broadbent, que nos presenta el tema la influencia del aprendizaje autorregulado en el aprendizaje online. La doctora Jacqueline Broadbent es directora asociada de la Escuela Enseñanza y Aprendizaje en Psicología de la Universidad de Deakin. En este rol de liderazgo, Jacqueline es responsable de la mejora continua de la calidad de la enseñanza y el aprendizaje dentro de la Facultad de Psicología. Es directora de cursos del conjunto de programas de honores de la escuela, que es uno de los programas de psicología de honores más grandes en Australia. Tiene un doctorado en psicología y un doctorado en educación. Ha ganado varios premios por su enseñanza, incluido el premio australiano altamente competitivo para profesores universitarios del año 2016 y la mención nacional australiana de aprendizaje y enseñanza por su destacada contribución al aprendizaje de los estudiantes del año 2011, ambos otorgados por el gobierno australiano, un título de enseñanza Desire to Learn. Muchas gracias, Jacqueline, por estar acá. Bienvenida y estaremos muy atentos a tu presentación.
Hi, everyone. The meaning of place is really important to the traditional owners of the land in Australia. So while we might be online for this meeting, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the Kulin Nation, a place that I have lived and worked for the last 16 years. and a place that is the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people. I want to give thanks to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, past and present, and acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has not been ceded. I will agree with Carol. It was a real privilege to come after Royce today, and to be honest, a little bit scary. So hopefully I can keep you all engaged for the next 40 minutes. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. I did originally do a PhD in psychology, and after I finished it, I sort of thought, oh, the area that I'm in, I'm not super interested in, and I actually started teaching in a really large first year health psychology unit that could have up to 2,000 students in it. It was all about getting people to exercise more or quit smoking or eat more healthily. And we had a lot of online students, and I thought, surely these things that we are applying to this health behaviour context could also be applied to students studying. And so it was really this foundation, and I'll give a shout out to Susie McFarlane, who I saw in the audience was kind of like my mentor at this time. It really got me interested in teaching and learning, that I came to think about self-regulated learning. And that's my love of trying to understand, I guess, how students self-regulate in the online environment is why I did a PhD in education. So a big shout out to my supervisors. I just only completed and passed my PhD very, very recently. So David Bowd and Ernesto Panandero for all their wisdom and a lot of patience with me. We have already talked a lot about self-regulation. So I don't want to dwell on it too much, but just for anybody who perhaps has only just joined us, self-regulation does refer to self-generated thoughts and feelings and actions that are planned and cyclically adapted to the attainment of personal goals. So in other words, self-regulated learning kind of provides us with this framework that helps to explain students' actions and their processes like metacognitive, behavioral, motivational, and emotional that they experience during academic tasks. And it could be really conscious for the student. It could be this explicit enactment of specific learning strategies, such as creating a concept map, or it could be unconscious, emotional reaction to receiving negative feedback. Although there are lots of different learning models, each that come from different theoretical perspectives, they do have common characteristics, which is that it is a cyclical process. It's comprised of cognition, metacognition, motivation, and emotion. And importantly, it's a set of skills that can be developed and learned. So today I'm just going to talk to you about a series of studies actually that was in my recent PhD that's looking at online self-regulated learning. So back in 2015, when I very first started thinking about this, there wasn't that much research that had been conducted looking at self-regulated learning strategies in online learning environments and academic performance in higher education. The vast majority of the research had focused on face-to-face instruction or blended learning, or if online learning strategies were the focus, often academic performance was not an outcome. So it was difficult to kind of ascertain how learners in the online environment utilized SRL strategies for academic success. The best evidence at the time was a really large meta-analysis that compared 126 studies of SRL strategy use and performance in a higher education setting that was by Richardson and colleagues in 2012. And they found that the strategies of effort regulation, time management, metacognition, elaboration, critical thinking, help seeking, and concentration were the best predictors of learners' grades. But it was kind of unclear, well, would this generalize to students who are studying wholly online? So in this very first study, what we looked at was we did a systematic review and meta-analysis, and we looked between 2004 and 2014 to see what strategies correlated with academic achievement in online higher education. And we ended up screening over 1,500 articles, assessed 130, and ended up only including 12. And the main reason a lot of them were excluded was that they didn't include any performance outcome in the study, or the students weren't wholly online. They might have intensives, or they were coming to class face-to-face at some of the time. So on the slide, you can see these were the strategies that were within those 12 studies. And the ones that were significant were time management, metacognition, effort regulation, and critical thinking. Peer learning also did have a positive moderate effect with academic achievement, but it wasn't significant. So what this systematic review suggested was that if online students who make good use of their time and they're conscious of their learning behavior, are critical in how they examine content and persevere in their understanding of learning materials despite the challenges that they face, they were more likely to be academically successful. These findings were pretty similar to what we were expecting from the face-to-face and what we see in the face-to-face environment based on that Richardson paper, but the effect sizes were a lot smaller. So Richardson's effect sizes ranged from 0.15 to 0.32, but in the online learning environment, they were much smaller. It was 0.05 to 0.14. And so we were kind of speculating, well, maybe the effects of the strategies might be dampened in the online environment, or maybe they don't equally transfer across the context. We also kind of noticed a few gaps in the literature when conducting this study, and this kind of built the next few studies that I'm going to talk about. So those gaps were this variation in what kind of learning strategies were included in studies. Some studies just look at one. In particular, metacognition was very popular. Although there was one or two studies that did kind of have a larger range of strategies within their studies, most actually only had, very few. So there was this kind of need to test a wide range of strategies empirically in relation to grade and the online context. The second gap was that very few studies had actually compared online learners with blended learners or traditional learners. And the third was strategies were, we know that students rarely kind of use one strategy in isolation, and it's much more likely that they're going to use a range of strategies together as part of their self-regulated learning process. But a lot of the literature in this area that at the time was kind of looking at summarizing trends across participants in the sample without really thinking about, okay, how do they combine these strategies to make different profiles? So this second study, we first wanted to, extend the literature by having a wide range of strategies, but also by comparing online and blended learners. So we could see if there were different effect sizes. So we were really looking at strategies students were using, such as time management, effort regulation, peer learning, metacognition, rehearsal, elaboration, organization, and critical thinking. And we also had subject grade. So this study actually, students were from all different subjects, and we were combining them together. So they weren't just all in one, psychology subject. They could be in psychology or mathematics or science, for example. And we had 140 online students and 466 blended learning students, and they all completed the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire, which is very popular, the MSLQ. And what we found was that online students were using a lot more SRL strategies or reporting that they were using a lot more SRL strategies than blended learners, with the exception of peer learning and help-seeking behaviours. However, despite some differences across predictive value of the enrolment status, these key SRL predictors were pretty comparable between the two groups. So despite online learners saying we're using these strategies a lot more than blended learners, the same strategies were predicting grade and they were getting the same academic outcome. We also, put them in a path analysis to look all together, to have a look at, in combination, what was the most predictive of grade, and time management and elaboration strategies positively affected grade, while kind of unsurprisingly, if you used rehearsal strategies, so that rote learning, it was more likely to have a negative effect on grade. So this study, as I said, we had students in all different subjects, and the subject grade is a combination of multiple assessments that they would have done in that subject. So we really wanted to drill down on a specific learning scenario, and we decided to do it with a formative assessment task, and we wanted to look at it across the two learning contexts. How do blended learners do this task in terms of self-regulated learning, and how do online learners do this task? So we were building on the first two studies, because we just included the strategies that we had found were significant. So time management, metacognition, effort regulation, and critical thinking. And we also included self-efficacy, and Carol talked about self-efficacy quite a few times. Richardson also, in that meta-analysis, found that it was the most significant predictor of grade. And as an aside, my PhD student at the time was also looking at, it was doing a meta-analysis of self-efficacy and academic achievement in higher education. And so she found that it was moderately correlated with academic performance. The other reason that we chose formative assessment was because there is quite a lot of literature regarding formative assessment and self-regulated learning, in particular the ways in which formative assessment improves self-regulated learning. For example, like Nicola McFarlane-Dick, and I think David is in the audience, argued that formative assessment sits within an SRL framework, and it can be used as a driver to improve student self-regulation. A paper that I did with Ernesto Panandero and David Bowd proposed 3 models in which formative assessment helps the learner to foster SRL by guiding learners to develop successful strategies over time. So in particular, the active role taken by the learner during formative assessment tasks teaches learners to develop metacognitive skills and to reflect and use feedback and to plan and set goals. However, we thought there is another way that self-regulated learning and formative assessment interact. And that is that, we can think of self-regulated learning as this set of individual characteristics or dispositions that are needed, really, to engage successfully with formative assessment right from the outset, particularly if the task that the learner is engaging in, requires them to enact feedback to improve their performance. So while it is very widely acknowledged that self-regulated learning is, needed to enact feedback, not that many studies have really focused on or drilled down into what actual SRL skills are necessary to take full advantage of a formative assessment task. And I guess I would say if you not investigating this baseline SRL ability, by default, you're kind of assuming some equivalence in learners prior to the engagement with the formative task. So we really thought, what? Learners are going to be limited by their cognitive and their metacognitive strategies, their motivational beliefs before they engage with a formative task. And we were really interested to see if those skills differed between learners, in particular online learners and blended learners. We kind of speculated, I guess, that successful self-regulated learners are going to engage with that initial formative task much more successfully, and then also engage more successfully with subsequent tasks. So what we actually did in this study was we evaluated SRL characteristics, the ones that I named earlier. We got students to do a formative task. This was actually embedded within a psychology subject. We then gave them what we called an indicative grade, just to help calibrate them. They got a rubric that was filled out, and they also got feedback from a teacher. They then were able to enact that feedback and resubmit the piece of work for a summative grade. And we also looked at the improvement score, so the difference between the indicative grade and the summative grade. So what we saw again was that online learners scored higher on all the variables than blended learners. From the outset, they're reporting that they're using a lot more self-regulated learning strategies. The grades were also very similar, not significantly different from one another at each time point. So for the formative task, on average, students were kind of scoring a low credit, which is around, for Australia, it's around 65%, 63 to 65%. And then for the summative task, they were getting a distinction, so in the sort of 75% range on average. We actually, ended up removing the really, really high achieving students who scored high on the formative task because they had less room for improvement, because we wanted to see what the improvement score would be for those people with a lot more room to improve. And it would be unsurprising to you that students, the formative assessment task had a positive effect on learning. On average, students increased 15 percentage points between the formative task and the summative task. So overall, the results demonstrated, or what we found, was that it was really crucial for online learners that they needed to be confident when approaching both the formative task and the summative task. So they needed to have an expectation before even engaging in the task that they were going to succeed. And after they received feedback, goal commitment, maintaining effort, and continued use of strategies helped learners to achieve the highest summative grades. And really the biggest gains, so those improvement scores, they really needed to concentrate on, having good blocks of study time and having undisturbed studying. Blended learners also needed to be confident to improve their grades, and they also needed to maintain effort regulation during formative, when they submitted that formative task. But again, just, it was noted, we know that they did report using these strategies less often. However, the variance accounted for by their formative grade and the grade improvement was a lot higher than the online learners. So they were using it less, but it was having a bigger impact for these blended learners. So again, we started speculating, what is going on? Is it this dampening of the strategies in the online learning environment? Online students need to utilize more strategies more often to get the same academic performance. And certainly this lack of different grade that we saw, so between all of the formative, summative task and improvement grade, is really consistent with this notion that they have to kind of do more to get the same success. So then in study 4, we wanted to build on what we had done, but we were using this variable-centered approach in these studies that I had just mentioned. And variable-centered approaches really operate at the group level. I guess they're summarizing trends across a participant sample. And they focus on associations between variables, as well as the contribution of predictor variables to an outcome. A limitation of this approach is that it neither kind of explains how learners combine various motivational learning strategies effectively, nor how they kind of integrate it into their learner profile. So we were really interested in this. We were thinking, well, maybe there's these meaningfully distinct subgroups that arise within this bigger group. And these different subgroups, they might differ on the types of SRL strategies and beliefs that they're using. So their profile would be different. And also they might differ in terms of academic performance. So one of the aims of this study really was to use this person-centered approach to look for these profiles in self-regulated learning, but also we wanted to include a lot more predictive variables in there. So we had the self-regulated learning strategies that I talked about in the previous 2 studies. But then also we wanted to include some motivational beliefs. So we had self-efficacy in there, so test anxiety, negative thoughts and affect. We wanted to look at task value and interest, so the learner's evaluation of interest, importance, and utility of the task. We had learners' control beliefs, so whether they thought it was within their control. And also we had intrinsic goal orientation, so whether they wanted to acquire mastery, as well as extrinsic goal orientation, such as they're doing the task because they want to get a good grade or outperform other people. So this is kind of what it looks like. We came up with five different profiles in self-regulated learning. We had about just over 600 participants in this sample, and a quarter of them were online learners. So we couldn't just focus on online learners in this context, but we were really interested in whether online learners belong to a particular profile or were excluded from profiles. And the 5 profiles that we came up with, the first one, class 1, comprised of 33% of the sample, about 200 participants, and they kind of tended towards low to moderate scores on self-regulated learning strategies and moderate scores on motivation. This was the largest group, and we called this group restrained regulators. The second class accounted for just under 10% of the sample, and we call this group minimal regulators because they tended to have the lowest scores of all the profiles. They had low to moderate scores on motivation and quite low scores on self-regulated learning factors. And really the pattern of this profile kind of suggested to us there was a potential disengagement from the learning process. The third class consisted of 16% of the sample, and they're very similar to the next class, class 4, but they really were distinguished by a couple of things, and that is they had the highest scores on test anxiety, and they also had the highest scores on peer learning and help seeking. So we called this group the anxious capable collaborators, and capable because they scored moderate to high on the remaining variables. Class 4 was nearly 30% of the sample, and they were labelled calm, self-reliant, capable regulators because this group scored the lowest of all on test anxiety, peer learning, and help seeking. All the strategies and motivations, they scored moderate to high. And the last group with this super regulators, and they were 15% of the sample, and we called them super regulators because they tended to score high on everything, much higher than the other profiles, aside from, again, peer learning and help seeking and test anxiety. We also then wanted to compare each of these profiles on age, subject grade, intention to study, so whether they reported, like how much they reported they into study and how often, automaticity, which we were looking at whether study was habit forming, their identified gender, and online versus blended learning. So unsurprisingly, we found the most adaptive, motivated, self-regulating profiles, in this case, class 4 and class 5, had the highest academic achievement, the highest intention to study, and the highest automaticity. And the opposite was true of the most non-adaptive profiles, in particular class 1 and class 2. They scored the lowest on academic achievement, intention to study, and automaticity. The minimal regulators, that class 2, were the youngest class. This is the group that scored kind of the lowest on everything. They had low grade average, they had lower intention to study and study automaticity. The restrained regulators at class 1 were also young, but had higher grades, intention to study and automaticity than these minimal regulators in class 2. The class 4 and 5, so the calm, self-reliant regulators and the super regulators, were comparable pretty much across the board. although super regulators did have higher intention to study and automaticity than the calm, self-reliant, capable regulators. It was really interesting because despite what I would call a superior SRL profile, the super regulators did not outperform the self-reliant regulators. So that class 5 that you think, okay, that's exactly what we might think, you know, they're super regulated students, they actually didn't do any better than class 4 academically. So we kind of speculated that maybe this group is going beyond what is actually necessary for the subsequent grade. Their, I guess, exaggerated profile and their strong engagement in the SRL strategies in that super regulated group could also be a manifestation of task-related anxiety, rather than genuine need for self-regulated learning strategy engagement. And we speculated this because although they still, scored fairly low on anxiety, it was significantly higher than that self-reliant, capable regulators. And also any of the groups that had high test anxiety, and I'm thinking really of class 3 here, where on everything else they're really moderate to high, look very similar to class 4. We sort of speculated that maybe test anxiety was having quite a negative effect on their performance. As I said, we were interested in where online learners were laying in these profiles, and the analysis didn't produce any group that just solely had only online learners in it, and nor was there any of the profiles where online students weren't represented. However, we did find that in that class 4 and 5, there was significantly more online learners who belonged to those 2 groups compared to the remaining 3. And really, I guess online learners, we would say, were more likely to belong to profiles that had less interaction with peers and instructors like teachers. We then did some post-hoc analysis as well, where we wanted to just look at the group differences of online learners and blended learners, and we found again that online learners were reporting using significantly more strategies. So they reported significantly more intrinsic motivation, task value, self-efficacy, elaboration, organization, metacognition, time management, effort regulation, but they did report less peer learning and help-seeking behaviors. So really, we found that the online learners were more likely to be in adaptive profiles. They were much more likely to be in ones that did not involve working or collaborating with others. So after we did this set of studies, I guess we started thinking, okay, could we then, work out a way to improve student self-regulated learning with an online intervention? So this study 5 was a review of different educational technologies that could be used to help learners to develop self-regulated learning. It could be either prior to or outside of their course, or as technology embedded within an online learning environment and used during learning. We considered a whole range of things in this review. We considered ready-made tools such as like blogs and podcasts and social media and wikis. We looked at intelligent tutoring systems like N and GStudy, MetaTutor. We looked at training and daily diaries, and we looked at learning analytics. And we also looked at sort of the challenges that we're facing in developing self-regulated learning through uses of technology as well. And that's what I'm going to focus on now. So in this review, we came up with 6 challenges that we saw in trying to enhance self-regulated learning using educational technology. And the first challenge was about our reliance to infer SRL processes using behavioural data. I'm going to use a big limitation of the studies that I've just talked about, which is, we were reliant on self-report data from the students. And while there is a lot of positives, it's cheap and it's scalable, can reach a lot of people, students aren't always accurate in their perceptions of when they're using a strategy or how often they're using it. And also, it doesn't really tell us about the quality of the strategy that they're using. So they might be using the strategy, but they might not necessarily be using it really well. And probably could spend like the whole presentation talking about this limitation. The second challenge that we saw was the unexplored effects of not including performance in studies, so that we were able to say, you know, this is how SRL affects student learning. The third challenge we saw was about looking at the whole SRL process. You know, the models and theories often define SRL as this recursive process between different phases. So if we're kind of pulling each phase apart and scrutinizing individual piece, you know, are we getting an accurate picture of the larger construct of self-regulated learning? And there is certainly some really promising work by Azevedo and Taub and a range of other people who are, you know, highlighting the importance of using multimodal, multi-channel SRL data to capture different aspects of SRL at the same time. So, you know, using eye tracking and log files and examining how these, you know, how this data interacts to predict performance. The fourth is whether it should be domain specific or domain general. So should it be embedded in a course, like should training SRL strategies in mathematics embedded within a mathematics course, or should it be very separate? You know, there's this tension. Things that are purpose-built content might have limited transferability, but the less specific content, which might be more far-reaching, might be less effective. We also really thought who the change agent was really important. If it's a teacher or a researcher, that is kind of problematic in terms of transferability of the intervention and the scalability. But you know, if it's computer-led, we still have a little bit of a way to go. But you know, I think as learning analytics continue to develop, they eventually will provide this sort of scalability of training that leverages like data from the student's own behavior, where they'll have an intelligent tutoring system with systems that have automated feedback and flexible pathways. And lastly, and Royce kind of touched on this a little bit, which was about, you know, the autonomy and the independence of the learner. So there is this kind of risk, like, does the interaction with technology build SRL in students, or does the technology that's supporting SRL on the assumption that that scaffold will always be there for students when they're learning? We think it's really important if we're going to progress in this area that ultimately still the onus really needs to lie with the student. The student needs to be able to self-regulate themselves. So the last study that I'm just going to talk about is a study where we ran our own intervention. Now, this was just a pilot study, so it was pretty small, and we couldn't address all of those 6 challenges, but we did try and capture all of the phases of the SRL process. We made it domain non-specific because we wanted it to be scalable and transferable, and we also made it computer-led rather than led by a researcher or teacher. So it was a randomized control study with 14 to 22 participants per one of 4 groups. Students filled out kind of a knowledge test and an SRL questionnaire at the start and then at the end of 21 days. So the first group was an online discipline independent training, and this was training that was designed by us. It comprised of 3 60 to 90-minute training sessions spaced out over the 21 days, and was delivered through a learning management system. And we did try and focus each of the sessions on the different sort of phases of SRL. So we had session 1 was on the forethought phase, and we looked at goal planning and time management. The second session was on the performance phase. So we were like looking at procrastination and metacognitive and cognitive strategies. The third session was on reflection. So we were looking at attribution errors, so self-motivation and self-rewarding. We had pretty good compliance. I would say it was quite strong. For the two groups that had training, students completed on average 2.75 training sessions, and there was a maximum of 3. The second group was a mobile app-based discipline independent diary. So this was daily diaries, an app on a mobile phone that we had created. It automatically alerted the students twice a day, once to ask them about before their study session and once to ask them about after study session. And they did not obviously need to fill out the diaries if they weren't planning on studying that day. So the before study session, we were asking students, well, what is your intention for this study session? You know, what are you planning? What goals are you setting? You know, what task analysis are you doing? What are your motivations? And then later we asked them in the after study session, well, actually, did you do those things that you planned? We also asked them about affect as well. Diary compliance was pretty strong throughout the 21 days. Participants on average filled out 27 diaries. The third group was a combination group, and that was that they did these 3 training sessions over 21 days, and at the same time they were filling out the daily diaries as well. And the control group got no intervention. So the 4 groups didn't differ on any of the baseline constructs at all at the start of the 21 days. And at the end of the 21 days, the combined condition was the far superior one. So they scored significantly higher on one or more or all of the groups on knowledge, elaboration, organization, critical thinking, metacognition, time management, and effort regulation. The online training condition, so not the combined, just training by itself, compared to the control, had higher control beliefs and metacognition. And the mobile app-based daily diaries did not significantly outperform the control condition or any condition for that matter. So this really suggested to us that participants who had training combined with daily diaries managed themselves and their surroundings during the learning tasks, and they were able to do a range of different things, including goal setting and self-monitoring. We also found that metacognitive strategies were only improved in sessions that had training, so we speculated that the training obviously had something to do with that. And we also pulled apart all of the daily diary data. So for both the combined condition and just the daily diary group. And we looked at their reported use of intention to use self-regulated learning strategies and their actual use. And interestingly, it was very flat for the daily diary group. They didn't show any improvement over time. But the combined group that was receiving training spaced out over the 21 days, we saw them incrementally increase both their intention to use the strategies and their report of using strategies. So indicating to us that the more they engaged in the training, then the more likely they started to embed that in their study habits. As I said, the daily diaries didn't improve anything, which I guess means that self-monitoring, or at least self-monitoring using our app, was not a useful intervention for SRL. And Carol talked about this in her talk about what clarifies is good, and Royce touched on it as well, this idea of like being able to evaluate what they're doing, evaluate judgment. So it's not sort of surprising that if you're self-monitoring but you don't really know what to do, that you can't improve just by looking at what you're doing without any kind of training for improvement. So I'll just finish up and say, I guess the main things for us were that this idea that they were using, online students were using a lot more strategies, or reported using a lot more strategies, but for the same academic outcomes as blended learning. The effect sizes were much, much smaller. We started thinking about what we would do next. One of the really big limitations of this projects was that we were using the MSLQ, which was traditionally for people in traditional classrooms. So we've been creating a questionnaire, the self-regulation for learning online questionnaire, the SRLO, which looks at a wide range of self-regulated learning strategies and motivations, and they're specifically tailored for online learning. And importantly, we've included things like negative achievement emotion that seems to have a big impact on students. We're also thinking about how we might find out how, break down how we might help students to improve grade. Just to give you a very quick example, we might look at whether a student has high or low self-efficacy. And if they, and then we look at, okay, they've got not high self-efficacy, but their task strategies are high, then their score is 71. But if it's low and they also don't have social support, their grade is going to be like a pass grade in the 59th, likely. If their self-efficacy is high, their intrinsic motivation is high, their effort regulation is high, and their emotional regulation is low, on average, a student will get a grade around 70. So it's just some interesting things that we're kind of playing with. And we're also trying to translate some of this work to novel contexts. So we're putting in a grant right now for an eating disorders intervention using an app, where part of it is this educational piece where we're looking at, all right, these participants need to engage with the intervention, they need to engage with the training, and we're going to try and use self-regulated learning to ensure that they are engaging to the highest level possible within that. Thank you so much for today. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Jacqueline. Muy interesante ponencia, muy completa, muchos estudios que hay que mirar y poder profundizar para también quizás aprender a cómo replicar algunos de ellos. Así que es fantástico, muchas gracias. Bien, vamos entonces con nuestra última ponencia. Les pido que pongamos el esfuerzo de terminar con la última ponencia, la atención ahora a los investigadores nacionales. Sé que ha sido una jornada larga, pero es muy interesante este estudio que nos quieren presentar los investigadores, la doctora Daniela Bruna y el doctor Carlos González, con el tema cómo fue la autorregulación de los estudiantes durante la pandemia, metas futuras para la educación superior remota, porque están basadas en datos de nuestro país. La doctora Daniela Bruna es psicóloga de la Universidad del Desarrollo y doctora de Psicología de la Universidad de Concepción, trabaja hace 11 años en la Universidad del Desarrollo, actualmente es la directora de la carrera de Psicología, es profesora de pregrado y posgrado, investigadora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento Educativo CIME. Sus áreas de interés son la docencia universitaria y dentro de esto, prácticas docentes para promover la autorregulación de los estudiantes universitarios, la evaluación para el aprendizaje y la evaluación auténtica. El doctor Carlos González es sociólogo de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, es doctor en educación de la Universidad de Sydney, y es postdoctorado del Instituto de Educación de la Universidad de Londres. Actualmente es profesor asociado del Departamento Currículum, Tecnología, Evaluación de la Facultad de Educación, director de posgrado de Educación de la Pontificia Universidad Católica y del Grupo Milenio en Educación Superior. Ha desarrollado investigaciones y proyectos en educación superior sobre las tecnologías de la información y la comunicación, la experiencia de los estudiantes y la docencia, entre otros. Muchas gracias, Carlos y Daniela, por estar acá, y los escuchamos con mucha atención.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Vamos a hacer nuestra presentación. Siempre difícil después de las presentaciones tan buenas que ya se hicieron. Es obviamente un desafío para nosotros, pero vamos a tratar de poner un contrapunto con la experiencia más local que vamos a presentar a través de este estudio que hemos llamado ¿Cómo fue la autorregulación de los estudiantes durante la pandemia? Metas futuras para la educación superior remota, y vamos a hacer esta presentación en conjunto con Daniela Bruna. Siguiente, por favor. Lo primero que es importante considerar es que nos encontramos en un momento de enormes desafíos e incertidumbre para las instituciones de educación superior, no solo en Chile, sino que alrededor del mundo. Como sabemos, ¿cierto?, la educación superior se ha visto profundamente afectada debido a la emergencia sanitaria del COVID-19, A principios del año 2020, más o menos 150 países suspendieron la educación presencial, lo que afectó a millones de estudiantes, y aunque en algunos países se ha ido retomando la educación presencial tradicional, o al menos un formato híbrido, esta disrupción está aparentemente lejos de estabilizarse. Como todos y todas hemos experimentado, las universidades tuvieron que adaptarse a lo que se ha denominado docencia remota de emergencia, que es una forma de instrucción que se ha materializado sin el tiempo ni los recursos necesarios para los procesos de diseño instruccional que habitualmente se emplean para el desarrollo de experiencias de aprendizaje en línea, ¿cierto? Y en este escenario, obviamente, la docencia y el aprendizaje se trasladaron al mundo virtual a través de las ya bien conocidas videoconferencias en plataformas como Zoom, como Google Meet, entre otras, el uso de las plataformas virtuales para el aprendizaje, como por ejemplo Canvas, y el uso de los recursos digitales de las bibliotecas, que han sido muy importantes en este escenario. Ciertamente las universidades tuvieron o han tenido la capacidad de adaptarse a este nuevo escenario, pero también, y esto de una u otra manera todos y todas lo sabemos, han surgido muchos problemas. Entre ellos, solo por mencionar algunos, ¿cierto? Los estudiantes y los profesores universitarios han resentido una excesiva carga de trabajo en la adaptación al entorno en línea, sobre todo en el contexto de incertidumbre asociado a la pandemia, ¿no? Han surgido críticas sobre la calidad del aprendizaje que se puede entregar en estos nuevos escenarios, y muy importantemente sobre qué tan válidas son las evaluaciones realizadas a través de los entornos virtuales. Al mismo tiempo, ¿cierto?, los problemas de conectividad que han sufrido muchos estudiantes en términos de los problemas de conexión, de acceso a computadores, tablets o celulares, incluso los espacios en sus casas desde donde los cuales pueden continuar o pudieron continuar aprendiendo en este contexto, han generado preguntas, ¿cierto?, o han puesto de manifiesto, mejor dicho, la persistencia de las desigualdades entre los estudiantes, particularmente en nuestro contexto más local, más chileno. Al mismo tiempo, la falta de interacción en los campus, esta falta de presencialidad que hemos tenido, ha puesto de alguna manera en tela de juicio el sentido de pertenencia de los estudiantes con sus instituciones, y además las oportunidades de aprendizaje que habitualmente los campus ofrecen más allá de la sala de clase. Encima de todos estos elementos, sobre todos estos elementos, y esto es importante también para nuestros invitados e invitadas internacionales, en el caso de Chile además veníamos con una disrupción del aprendizaje universitario y del país en general, a propósito del estallido social que tuvimos a fines de 2019 y de los temas, digamos, los problemas sociales a nivel país que han seguido durante todo el periodo de la pandemia y a esta hora. Entonces, es en este escenario que creemos que es importante visualizar, ¿cierto?, cómo han experimentado los y las estudiantes el aprendizaje durante estos tiempos de crisis. En el caso de este estudio, en función de la autorregulación de los estudiantes durante la pandemia y durante este periodo de disrupción en Chile. Y lo que vamos a hacer acá entonces es presentar los resultados iniciales de una encuesta que, entre otros elementos, evaluó la autorregulación del aprendizaje en estudiantes universitarios chilenos en el contexto de la pandemia.
Bueno, en este contexto que les acaba de relatar Carlos, de nuestro país, pero también del mundo, la autorregulación del aprendizaje aparece, ¿no es cierto?, como una variable y como una característica de los estudiantes muy importante de potenciar, ya que podría ser una posible respuesta a cómo lograr que ellos se adapten de mejor manera a los procesos de enseñanza y aprendizaje online, que al menos en nuestro país, en pregrado, eran un proceso completamente nuevo que la mayoría de ellos no había vivido, ¿ya? Bueno, la autorregulación ha sido el tema de todo este panel, ¿no es cierto? Pero también es bueno contarles desde qué lugar la estamos mirando nosotros, ¿ya? La autorregulación, como lo dijo Jacqueline, es un proceso proactivo, de carácter además iterativo, lo cual implica que es cíclico, y autodirigido, que implica que de alguna manera los aprendices conducen sus pensamientos, sus sentimientos y sus acciones hacia el logro de metas que son impuestas personalmente, que tienen sentido para ellos, ¿no es cierto? Y donde la meta es que puedan de alguna manera planificar, monitorear, regular, controlar y evaluar el cumplimiento de estos objetivos y mejorar su efectividad, ¿ya? La autorregulación es una línea de investigación que es mainstream dentro de educación y también dentro de la psicología educacional, porque en el fondo se ha probado que es una variable sumamente importante. Más adelante les vamos a hablar de cuál es el impacto que tiene y cómo se relaciona con otras variables del aprendizaje de los estudiantes, pero además es una nueva manera de entender el aprendizaje, integrando variables que hasta ese momento, hasta hace 20 años atrás, eran más bien investigadas como de manera aislada, ¿ya? Y en este modelo, particularmente, uno de los primeros autores es Barry Zimmerman, un autor norteamericano, que propone que es un proceso que tiene 3 grandes fases, ¿ya? Donde en la primera los estudiantes se disponen o se preparan, lo que en inglés se conoce como forethought, y que implica que cuando un estudiante se enfrenta a un desafío, lo primero que debería hacer es analizar cuál es la tarea que tiene enfrente, ¿ya? Y eso implica, de alguna manera también, entender la tarea profundamente y también, como dijo Royce, entender qué es lo que nosotros queremos que el estudiante haga al final, ¿no es cierto? Que sería lo que llamamos como evaluative judgment, que muchos estudiantes, ¿no es cierto?, no lo ponen en juego cuando se preparan, ¿ya? Además implica seleccionar cuáles son las mejores estrategias para poder, de alguna manera, cumplir con esas metas, ¿no es cierto?, que se han planteado en relación a la tarea, y algo que es sumamente importante y que Jacqueline lo tocó profundamente, tiene que ver con activar creencias cognitivo-motivacionales, como por ejemplo la percepción de autoeficacia, la motivación intrínseca, el compromiso con las tareas, ¿no es cierto?, y la motivación, ¿ya? Los estudiantes autorregulados analizan esa tarea, se plantean metas y activan estas creencias, y luego cuando están realizando la tarea pasan a la fase de desempeño, que implica, ¿no es cierto?, un monitoreo profundo del propio desempeño y del propio comportamiento y la afectividad, etcétera. Implica que los estudiantes pueden darse, por ejemplo, instrucciones a sí mismos, que pueden también hacer experimentos y probar a través de ensayo y error diferentes estrategias y poder ir viendo si esas estrategias son las adecuadas e irlas cambiando mientras están llevando a cabo el desempeño. Y eso, ¿no es cierto?, permite que cuando terminen la tarea ocurra la fase de autorreflexión, ¿no es cierto?, donde el estudiante es capaz de autoevaluar su propio desempeño, logrando, ¿no es cierto?, incorporar estos criterios, entenderlos de manera profunda, hacerlos parte de su desempeño para futuras tareas. ¿Y qué es lo que podríamos entender como el evaluative judgment o juicio crítico, del cual habló bastante, ¿no es cierto?, Royce hace un rato atrás, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, si ustedes se fijan, es una variable que de alguna manera implica que los estudiantes van a estar profundamente dentro de su proceso de aprendizaje, que no va a ser algo que ocurra como de manera espontánea, sino que va a ser un proceso reflexivo, metacognitivo, ¿no es cierto?, que permite mejorar y sobre todo poder planificar futuros procesos. Y por eso la autorregulación se convierte en algo tan importante en pandemia, porque de alguna manera permite que el estudiante pueda planificarse, monitorearse y reflexionar sobre sus propios procesos en este escenario nuevo, ultra cambiante, ¿no es cierto? Los estudiantes en Chile han pasado incluso como de online a lo híbrido, y obviamente estas habilidades y este conjunto de estrategias puede ayudarlos a vivir el proceso de mucho mejor manera.
¿Puedes pasarlas todas, por favor, Daniela? Una perspectiva complementaria y que ha mostrado tener una relación importante con la autorregulación es la de los enfoques de aprendizaje. Y esta perspectiva básicamente ha discernido entre una aproximación profunda, una superficial y una estratégica al aprendizaje, donde en la aproximación profunda los estudiantes tienen la intención de maximizar la comprensión de los contenidos, integrándolos con conocimientos previos y tratando de integrar teoría con la práctica, para de este modo organizar y ver el contenido en un todo coherente, considerando la tarea que enfrentan como una actividad personal para mejorar su conocimiento y por lo tanto tienen un interés personal por el trabajo académico que están realizando. Por el contrario, cuando los estudiantes están enfocados en una aproximación superficial, su intención es más bien tratar de cumplir con los requisitos del curso de manera de tratar de pasarlo con lo que se ha tendido a entender como el mínimo esfuerzo, y despliegan estrategias que tienen que ver con rutinas que facilitan más bien la memorización. Y finalmente hay un enfoque, o se ha discernido un enfoque de tipo más bien estratégico, en el cual los estudiantes y las estudiantes se enfocan en organizar y maximizar su tiempo con el objetivo de obtener los mejores resultados académicos. Y la investigación ha mostrado, ¿cierto?, que una combinación entre el enfoque estratégico y el enfoque profundo tiende a que los estudiantes, o hace que los estudiantes tiendan a lograr mejores resultados académicos. Esto también consideramos que era importante de ser mirado en el contexto en línea y por lo tanto fue incluido. Siguiente, por favor. En esta diapositiva me voy a enfocar en por qué vale la pena promover estos procesos de autorregulación de los estudiantes. Y en primer lugar, se ha mostrado que la autorregulación explica mejor que otras variables el logro y el desempeño de los estudiantes. Mejor que otras variables tales como aquellas relacionadas con habilidades cognitivas y inteligencia, que son las variables de alguna manera más tradicionales que tienden a ser evaluadas, y por lo tanto no son solo las actividades cognitivas y de inteligencias tradicionales las que explican por sí solas el logro académico, sino que la autorregulación tiene un peso y una importancia clave en este sentido. En segundo lugar, y muy importante en el caso chileno, pues el sistema de educación superior presenta un problema importante de retención, donde aproximadamente un 30% de los estudiantes dejan sus estudios al primer año y aproximadamente la mitad, ¿cierto?, de los que continúan no completan sus estudios de nivel superior en el tiempo que está establecido. Asocia la autorregulación a un buen ajuste académico, es decir, a una buena adaptación a la vida universitaria y a mayores tasas de retención de los estudiantes, lo que, como les decía, en el caso chileno es algo muy importante dadas las características que hoy en día tiene nuestro sistema. Al mismo tiempo, y relacionado con lo que decía Daniela, es importante en un contexto de educación remota, donde, como se comentó anteriormente, los profesores y estudiantes se han enfrentado a procesos nuevos que no conocían, y en este escenario creemos que la autorregulación les permitiría planificar, monitorear y ejecutar cómo están llevando a cabo estas nuevas iniciativas, digamos, cómo se están desempeñando en este nuevo contexto. Y esto es muy importante porque, como también decía Daniela antes, en el caso chileno, la mayoría de los estudiantes de pregrado no tenía experiencia en contextos de clases full online, debido a que la tradición que tenemos en Chile es que mayormente los pregrados se realizan de manera completamente presencial, a diferencia de otras partes del mundo. En cuarto lugar, fomentar la autorregulación también es importante porque permite el desarrollo de habilidades que van más allá del contexto actual de estudio de los estudiantes, que pueden perdurar para toda la vida y que también pueden extrapolarse a otros contextos. realizar acciones de planificación de la tarea, de monitoreo de cómo lo están haciendo, son efectivamente actividades estratégicas a la hora de poder desarrollar acciones de una manera más efectiva, más positiva, pues permiten planificar, establecer metas, monitorear lo que uno está haciendo, si lo está haciendo bien o no, y ciertamente todos estos elementos contribuyen a un mejor desempeño, no solo en el ámbito de estudio que los estudiantes están llevando a cabo, sino también, como les decía, puede extrapolarse a otros ámbitos de desempeño, particularmente futuro de los estudiantes. Y finalmente, en esta línea, es importante destacar que la literatura ha mostrado que la autorregulación es una habilidad que es posible entrenar, ¿ya? Que se puede entrenar y que por lo tanto hay un espacio, o se abre un espacio, digamos, para poder trabajarla, para fomentarla, sobre todo en los primeros años, donde los estudiantes vienen del sistema escolar, no necesariamente con las habilidades que requieren, al menos en el caso chileno, para poder enfrentar productivamente su vida universitaria, y ojalá estas habilidades, esta habilidad de autorregulación se materializara en los cursos, o sea, como actividades intracurriculares, ¿cierto? Por lo tanto, nosotros vemos que potenciar, invertir o generar programas de apoyo que tengan que ver con el fomento de la autorregulación es muy importante para promover estas habilidades en los estudiantes, y de alguna manera uno podría especular que se podría incidir indirectamente o directamente tal vez en estos problemas que detectamos que el sistema de educación superior en Chile tiene en términos de retención y abandono.
Ahí sí, estaba silenciada. Tomando en cuenta todos estos antecedentes, ¿no es cierto?, que les acabamos de presentar, la pregunta de esta investigación en específico tiene que ver con qué ha ocurrido en pandemia, con la autorregulación. ¿Cómo ha sido este proceso? ¿Cómo lo han llevado a cabo nuestros estudiantes en Chile? ¿Sí? Sobre todo tomando en cuenta aspectos que presentó Verónica ayer, ¿no es cierto? Si ustedes recuerdan, presentó diferentes aspectos de cómo ha sido el proceso online en Latinoamérica, mostrando, ¿no es cierto?, que tenemos brechas muy grandes con otros países que ya se habían subido a la cultura online, pero también temas que tienen que ver con desigualdades, ¿no es cierto?, con el acceso a las condiciones, como por ejemplo conexión a internet, espacios físicos para poder estudiar de manera privada y tranquila, por ejemplo, etc. Entonces, creemos que es una pregunta interesante de hacernos, ¿no es cierto?, que además nos puede dar grandes lecciones acerca de cómo seguir, porque mucho de la pandemia y de cómo ha sido el proceso de enseñanza se va a quedar con nosotros, independiente que la pandemia en algún momento desaparezca. Ya. Me avisan si se apaga el micrófono porque se me estaba apagando como automáticamente, ¿ya? Pero ya lo solucioné, me llegó un mensaje. Bueno, y particularmente este estudio está dentro de un proyecto que comenzó el 2020 y que continúa durante el 2021, un proyecto COVID que fue adjudicado por la Universidad del Desarrollo, que es dirigido por Verónica Villarroel, que tiene por nombre Evaluación Nacional del Proceso de Enseñanza y Aprendizaje Remoto durante la pandemia de COVID-19 en la educación superior, y que su objetivo general tiene que ver con caracterizar el proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje remoto durante la pandemia desde la experiencia de los estudiantes universitarios, ¿ya? En este proyecto participan 15 investigadores de 13 universidades a lo largo de todo el país, ¿no es cierto?, inclusive de 11 regiones, y contamos también con la asesoría de 17 asesores a lo largo del mundo, y hasta el minuto hemos hecho 2 evaluaciones en docentes y estudiantes. La primera de ellas fue realizada el año pasado, y la segunda de ellas durante el primer semestre. Y lo que vamos a hacer ahora es que les vamos a mostrar parte de los resultados de la aplicación que se hizo a los estudiantes durante este primer semestre del 2021. ¿Y qué evaluamos? ¿Ya? La verdad es que aplicamos una batería bastante completa de procesos de aprendizaje para los estudiantes y particularmente variables que son directamente autorregulación o que están estrechamente vinculadas, ¿no es cierto? Como por ejemplo el engagement que han hablado, ¿no es cierto? Y específicamente intentamos evaluar la autorregulación de la emoción y la motivación a través del Emotion and Motivation Self-Regulation Questionnaire, que es un cuestionario que lo que busca es entender cómo son los mensajes y las instrucciones que los estudiantes se dan a sí mismos para regular sus emociones y sus motivaciones durante las tareas, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, tiene que ver con eso en particular, con la etapa de monitoreo de la autorregulación. También evaluamos la autorregulación del aprendizaje a través del inventario de procesos de autorregulación del aprendizaje, que evalúa, ¿no es cierto?, estas tres grandes etapas de la autorregulación, cómo los estudiantes se preparan, cómo se monitorean y cómo se autoevalúan. Evaluamos también el sentido de agencia, ¿no es cierto?, que tiene que ver con una percepción subjetiva acerca de cuáles los factores que influyen en el propio comportamiento, si esos factores son internos, en otras palabras, si dependen de mí como estudiante, o si son factores, ¿no es cierto?, que son externos, como por ejemplo el profesor, la institución, el contexto, etcétera, que obviamente era muy importante en pandemia, ¿ya? También evaluamos engagement, entendido como la capacidad de incorporarse a las actividades académicas con alto vigor, ¿no es cierto?, con absorción, con dedicación, estilos de aprendizaje que tenía que ver con los estilos de los estudiantes en relación a sus actividades, a las estrategias y a sus motivaciones, enfoques de aprendizaje, intentando ver si el aprendizaje era de alguna manera superficial, profundo o estratégico, desde el modelo que les presentó Carlos al inicio, y también el aprendizaje percibido de los estudiantes en este contexto. ¿Quiénes participaron? Participaron 2.762 estudiantes a lo largo del país, 53% de la muestra eran mujeres, 22,1% eran hombres, ¿no es cierto? Ahí hay un error, y la edad en promedio era de 21,69 años, ¿ya? También en relación al nivel de estudio, comentarles que en Chile nuestros programas los dividimos en 3 ciclos formativos: bachilleratos primer y segundo año, licenciaturas el tercer y cuarto, y título, ¿no es cierto?, que es el último año, y la mayoría de los estudiantes, o sea, 55,8%, pertenecían a bachillerato, 35,3% a licenciatura, 8,9% a título, ¿sí? Y también quisimos caracterizar si es que tenían experiencias remotas previas, y lo que encontramos, ¿no es cierto?, es que la mayoría, casi un 70%, nunca habían tenido asignaturas ni actividades remotas online, versus un 30,6% que sí las habían tenido, porque muchas universidades estaban partiendo con cursos, por ejemplo, B-Learning o e-learning, ¿no es cierto?, dentro de sus modelos formativos, pero era algo bastante incipiente en la educación superior chilena. Y además, estos estudiantes pertenecían a 21 universidades del país, y la mayor parte eran universidades tradicionales, regionales. Y ahora los dejo con Carlos, que les va a presentar parte de los resultados.
Gracias, Daniela. En esta diapositiva vamos a partir con la presentación de resultados, y lo que tenemos aquí son las diferencias entre hombres y mujeres en una serie de variables que consideramos en este estudio. En la diapositiva solo se presentan aquellas variables que tuvieron resultados que son estadísticamente significativos, y vamos a ver algunos resultados que son salientes o más relevantes, digamos, en este estudio. En primer lugar, es importante llamar la atención respecto de las mujeres y de aquellos elementos que tienen que ver con el constructo de autorregulación, donde ellas presentaron puntajes significativamente más altos que los hombres en preparación y en monitoreo. Es decir, estos resultados sugieren que son personas que analizarían la tarea, que planificarían estratégicamente, que se plantearían metas y activarían acciones de metacognición al momento de preparar y de planificar su tarea, y también en el momento del monitoreo. O sea, serían capaces de mirar su propio proceso, de anticipar lo que se están haciendo, de incorporar cambios si es necesario, etc. Estos resultados nos llevan a sugerir que en pandemia las mujeres se autorregularon mejor en el aprendizaje que sus pares hombres. Además mostraron un uso más alto de tecnologías digitales para el aprendizaje, lo que también podría estar asociado al hecho de su aproximación estratégica y planificada al estudio. Sin embargo, hay algunos elementos en los cuales también las mujeres presentan resultados que son estadísticamente significativos respecto a sus pares hombres, pero que tienden a ser tal vez un poco más negativos, como por ejemplo la percepción de exigencia evaluativa, donde ellas tienden a percibir que las evaluaciones son más exigentes que sus pares hombres, también respecto de la regulación negativa del estrés, están en una situación donde se sienten comparativamente con sus pares masculinos, sienten estar más sobrepasadas frente a los desafíos que imponen los cursos, lo que implicaría que de alguna forma les cuesta tener estrategias más apropiadas para enfrentarlo. Y finalmente también presentan un puntaje mayor en la variable de agencia negativa, lo que implica que tal vez ellas no sienten que están en control de lo que les pasa, sino que más bien lo que pasa respecto de sus procesos de aprendizaje, sienten o perciben que no depende directamente de ella. Por lo tanto, esto muestra de alguna forma, ¿cierto?, o estos resultados sugieren una visión en donde las mujeres tienen efectivamente una mayor capacidad de autorregulación que sus pares hombres, pero sin embargo aparecen un poco más estresadas, sintiendo que lo que ocurre está fuera de lo que ellas tienen alcance de controlar, y perciben a su vez una evaluación más exigente, la perciben más exigente que sus pares hombres. Por otro lado, los hombres presentan puntajes significativamente más altos en autorregulación positiva de la motivación y en vigor, lo que sugiere que de alguna manera los hombres le dan un sentido más personal a las tareas, se centran más confiadamente en su aprendizaje, tienen un abordaje más positivo, o sea, están de alguna forma más confiados en sus procesos de aprendizaje, y esto de alguna forma se relaciona con esta idea de mayor vigor, pues tienen más energía puesta en la tarea y se enfocan menos, por ejemplo, en el cansancio. Por lo tanto, respecto de sus pares mujeres, estos resultados sugieren que los estudiantes hombres se sienten más confiados y abordan con más energía su proceso de aprendizaje. Siguiente, por favor. En esta diapositiva nos enfocamos en aquellas variables donde se encontraron resultados que son estadísticamente significativos en términos del ciclo formativo en el cual se encuentran los y las estudiantes. En este sentido es importante recordar, como nos decía Daniela, que hemos clasificado a aquellos que están en bachillerato como los que están en primero y segundo año, licenciatura tercer y cuarto año, y título los que están en quinto año o más. ¿Cierto? Y acá, en primer lugar, es importante destacar que quienes están en el ciclo de bachillerato percibieron significativamente mayor empatía de sus profesores y profesoras que aquellos que estaban en licenciatura o título, es decir, percibieron que sus profesores y profesoras se preocuparon más de cómo estaban, que tuvieron más tiempo para ver situaciones personales, etc. En segundo lugar, respecto a la percepción de aprendizaje, es decir, cuánto percibieron que aprendieron los estudiantes en este periodo de pandemia desde una perspectiva subjetiva, existen diferencias que son estadísticamente significativas entre bachillerato y licenciatura, siendo mayor en bachillerato. Es decir, estos estudiantes de bachillerato percibieron o tuvieron una idea de que habían aprendido, ¿cierto?, más en este contexto que sus pares de licenciatura y título. Luego, respecto de honestidad, que tiene que ver con cómo los estudiantes declararon si habían copiado o no en este contexto, algo que ha sido muy sensible, digamos, en estos escenarios de docencia y aprendizaje remoto. Hubo diferencias significativas respecto de licenciatura y título en relación a bachillerato, donde los estudiantes de los cursos superiores, es decir, licenciatura y título, tendieron a reconocer que copiaban más que aquellos de bachillerato. Después, en relación a la percepción de exigencia evaluativa, es decir, qué tan difícil, qué tan exigentes son las evaluaciones, aquellos y aquellas estudiantes de licenciatura, en licenciatura tendieron a percibir una mayor exigencia respecto a aquellos que estaban en bachillerato y título, ¿cierto? Respecto de la autorregulación orientada a la evitación, hay diferencias que son estadísticamente significativas entre bachillerato y licenciatura, siendo mayor en esta última, lo que implica que los estudiantes de nivel de licenciatura tendían a sentir que el trabajo que realizan es complejo, es aburrido, que no vale la pena invertir tiempo en eso, etc. En términos de lo que se llama agencia negativa, ¿cierto? Existen diferencias significativas entre bachillerato y título, siendo mayor en bachillerato. Es decir, los y las estudiantes de bachillerato tendrían una mayor percepción, ¿cierto?, respecto de lo que les pasa en relación al aprendizaje. No depende tanto de ellos, sino que hay otros factores externos que estarían afectando su aprendizaje. En relación con vigor, es decir, aquella sensación de que los estudiantes tienen ganas de participar en sus clases, en sus instancias de aprendizaje, que se sienten con energía, que perseveran cuando están estudiando, que están dispuestos o dispuestas a mantenerse trabajando por periodos largos de tiempo, sin descanso, etc., aparece con puntajes significativamente más altos en el ciclo de título que en bachillerato y en licenciatura. En relación al aprendizaje superficial, hay diferencias que son estadísticamente significativas entre bachillerato y título, siendo mayor en bachillerato, lo que es bastante coherente con estudios de esta naturaleza, ¿cierto? Que han mostrado que los estudiantes tienden a desplegar enfoques de tipo superficial en sus primeros años de universidad, debido al proceso de ajuste en que están insertándose, ¿cierto?, en los contextos universitarios. Y finalmente, en esta diapositiva, respecto del uso de tecnologías digitales, hay diferencias significativas en aquellos estudiantes que están en bachillerato, es decir, en los 2 primeros años de su formación universitaria, quienes declaran haber usado más tecnologías digitales que aquellos estudiantes que están en los otros 2 ciclos formativos. Siguiente, por favor. En esta diapositiva se presentan los resultados, ¿cierto? Si hay diferencias significativas entre aquellos estudiantes, como mencionaba antes Daniela, que habían tenido experiencia previa o no con clases remotas, ¿ya? Previa, digamos, antes de la pandemia. Eso era lo importante. Y como también se mencionaba acá, es importante recordar que previo a la pandemia, la enseñanza en línea en el contexto chileno era algo básicamente resistido. No había mucho desarrollo en esa área y por lo tanto el número de estudiantes que efectivamente habían tenido esa experiencia no era muy alto, en el rango del 30%, como también nos indicaba antes Daniela, ¿cierto? Y solo algunas instituciones habían empezado a tener algunos espacios, tal vez en cursos de formación general, etcétera. Ahora, en términos de la experiencia de aprendizaje en pandemia propiamente tal, aquellos que previo al tema del COVID tuvieron la experiencia de cursos dictados de forma en línea, percibieron una mayor empatía de los docentes, además de percibir una buena calidad de aprendizaje, experimentar un mayor vigor, desplegar un aprendizaje de tipo más estratégico que aquellos estudiantes que no tuvieron la experiencia previa con educación remota. Es decir, ¿cierto?, tuvieron una experiencia de aprendizaje mejor o más positiva, percibida mejor y más positivamente que aquellos estudiantes que no habían tenido clases en línea. Y probablemente esto se deba a que ya conocían cómo operaba, digamos, este sistema de la educación en línea.
Bueno, y otra de las cosas que quisimos indagar tuvo que ver con si habían diferencias en estas variables según el tipo de evaluación que tenían que responder los estudiantes, ¿ya? Y si ustedes se fijan, diferentes autores, incluso dentro de esta misma, de este mismo panel y del seminario, por ejemplo, ayer Margaret Bierman y hoy día todos, ¿no es cierto?, Jacqueline, Royce, Carol, hablaron de lo importante que es la forma en que nosotros evaluamos a nuestros estudiantes para promover la autorregulación y que obviamente tareas complejas, tareas donde los estudiantes tengan que poner en juego las competencias, y también tareas que sitúan a los estudiantes en problemáticas, ¿no es cierto?, etcétera, y donde ellos mismos tengan que ir descubriendo y construyendo cuáles son los criterios que se espera de ellos, va a fomentar la autorregulación del aprendizaje, ¿ya? Y entonces en ese sentido quisimos ver si habían diferencias, ¿ya? Por ejemplo, encontramos diferencias significativas en empatía en pandemia. ¿Y qué quiere decir esto? Que los estudiantes que eran evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño, ¿no es cierto?, tienen la percepción de que sus profesores son más empáticos, ¿ya? Ahora tenemos que pensemos un poco para contextualizar los resultados en cómo son las evaluaciones, ¿ya? Normalmente las pruebas con ítems de respuestas cerradas y abiertas son hechas en plataformas, son evaluaciones estandarizadas, muchas veces contra el tiempo, pero además como con lógicas que son bastante artificiales y que son lógicas solo academicistas que no tienen tanto sentido en el mundo del trabajo y fuera del aula. Como por ejemplo que el estudiante marque una alternativa y no pueda volver atrás y cambiarla si es que en la prueba se monitorea y se da cuenta que está erróneo, ¿ya? Entonces, también es importante contextualizar eso, porque entonces los estudiantes que son evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño, donde muchas veces los profesores, por ejemplo, suben una tarea que el alumno tiene que descargar, la completa y la vuelve a subir, sienten que hay mayor empatía, ¿ya? Además, los estudiantes que son evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño durante la pandemia, perciben además que hay mayor interacción dialógica en clases con sus profesores y que hay mayor participación, ¿ya? Y obviamente esto podría tener que ver también con el feedback, porque las tareas basadas en desempeño permiten un feedback más individualizado y más profundo que solamente una comprensión de por qué tuviste un puntaje o no lo tuviste, ¿ya? En relación a la percepción de aprendizaje, se puede observar que los estudiantes que fueron evaluados con pruebas de ítems de respuesta cerrada, como por ejemplo alternativas, ¿sí?, lo que también conocemos como opción múltiple, son estudiantes que percibieron significativamente peor aprendizaje que los estudiantes que fueron evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño. En relación a la regulación negativa del estrés, los estudiantes que fueron evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño presentaban menos este tipo de regulación. O sea, los estudiantes que son evaluados con pruebas estandarizadas y escritas regulan mucho peor su estrés. Por otro lado, en relación al aprendizaje superficial, los estudiantes que fueron evaluados con pruebas con ítems de respuesta cerrada, ¿no es cierto?, tienen un enfoque de aprendizaje mayoritariamente superficial. Además, los estudiantes con tareas basadas en desempeño, contrariamente a lo que muchas veces se pensó en las instituciones, de que en el fondo si hacíamos las preguntas en una plataforma contra el tiempo estandarizada, los estudiantes iban a adquirir mayores competencias digitales, la verdad es que fue un poco al revés. Los estudiantes que fueron evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño reportan mayor uso de estos recursos que los estudiantes evaluados con otro tipo de formas. Y aprendizaje percibido, los estudiantes con tareas basadas en desempeño, ¿no es cierto?, perciben mayor aprendizaje que los estudiantes evaluados a partir de otras maneras. Y finalmente también quisimos trabajar en entender qué es lo que predice que un estudiante se autorregule en pandemia, ¿ya? Para eso, ¿no es cierto?, hicimos un modelo predictivo a través de regresión lineal, donde la variable dependiente, ¿no es cierto?, era la autorregulación del aprendizaje. Y el modelo más parsimonioso y que mejor cumplía los supuestos y en el fondo lo que se necesita para hacer una regresión lineal es un modelo que habla de que si el estudiante tiene un enfoque estratégico, lo cual quiere decir que a nivel de autorregulación, ¿no es cierto?, es un estudiante que se planifica muy bien, ¿ya?, pero además que se orienta al proceso, que a nivel de autorregulación tiene que ver obviamente con la capacidad de monitoreo, y un estudiante que se enfrenta con energía, con vigor a sus actividades en relación al engagement, es un estudiante que en pandemia va a ser capaz de autorregularse de mejor manera.
Para ir avanzando en las conclusiones, ¿cierto? Lo primero que es importante destacar, como dice la diapositiva, es que el género sí importa. Lo que los resultados mostraron es que las mujeres se autorregulan más, sobre todo en las fases de preparación y monitoreo, que tienen valores más altos en otras variables asociadas al aprendizaje, como por ejemplo el aprendizaje estratégico, y que también tienen ciertos problemas para regular el estrés, que perciben una mayor exigencia académica y menor vigor que sus pares masculinos. Por lo tanto, una meta o una propuesta aquí en esta área que se podría desplegar es comprender qué explica esta diferencia entre hombres y mujeres, y ya hay algunos avances en esta dirección, en términos de analizar las respuestas abiertas que contenían los cuestionarios y en avanzar en hacer análisis más específicos, más sofisticados de los datos que hoy día estamos presentando para poder efectivamente comprender en mayor profundidad este fenómeno. También en términos más pragmáticos se podría tratar de avanzar a que todos los estudiantes se autorregulen, independiente de su género. Pues como antes se mencionó, la autorregulación es muy importante por una serie de elementos que tienen que ver con que los estudiantes tengan la capacidad, que los estudiantes que poseen esta capacidad de autorregulación, ¿cierto?, presentan mejor ajuste a la educación universitaria, mejor retención, que son habilidades que son extrapolables a otros contextos de la vida, etc. Por lo tanto, creemos que enseñarle explícitamente este tipo de habilidad a los estudiantes en programas que ojalá sean intracurriculares es algo en lo que se podría avanzar en materializar independientemente del género. O sea, esto es algo que se necesita tanto por hombres como mujeres. Y finalmente en esta diapositiva, tratar de avanzar en lograr que las mujeres perciban el proceso de aprendizaje de manera más positiva, ¿cierto? Donde puedan superar tal vez esta percepción de estrés y esta percepción de estar con las exigencias demasiado altas. Respecto del momento de la trayectoria educacional en la cual los estudiantes se encuentran, los resultados que presentamos sugieren que en bachillerato los estudiantes percibieron una mayor empatía de parte de sus profesores, una mayor sensación de que aprendieron en este contexto remoto o full en línea, y reportaron también copiar menos. Sin embargo, también reportaron un enfoque más superficial de aprendizaje y una sensación o una percepción de lo que están haciendo para su aprendizaje no está tanto en las manos de ellos, sino que hay otros elementos externos que influyen en lo que finalmente ellos pueden materializar en términos de su aprendizaje. ¿Ya? En términos de la licenciatura, se expresó un mayor uso de recursos digitales, pero al mismo tiempo una mayor sensación de exigencia evaluativa. O sea, los estudiantes en este nivel percibieron, ¿cierto?, que las evaluaciones eran exigentes, etcétera, en este contexto. Y finalmente en el nivel de título se aprecia mayor vigor respecto de los otros niveles, de los otros momentos, digamos, de la trayectoria educativa. En términos de las propuestas o de las metas de hacia dónde se podría seguir avanzando, tomando como base estos resultados que hemos presentado, en primer lugar sería importante apoyar a los estudiantes de los primeros años, sobre todo, a generar una mayor agencia personal, ¿cierto?, de manera en los cursos mismos, para poder generar un enfoque más profundo desde los primeros años. ¿Ok? Por lo tanto, estos elementos creemos que podrían influir positivamente en mejorar el rendimiento académico, la retención, etc. Además, considerando que efectivamente hay una percepción de que hay algún tipo de copia o de deshonestidad académica en las evaluaciones, independiente del nivel, ¿cierto? Es importante mostrar o desarrollar esta idea de que en todos los niveles debería haber algún tipo de sanciones claras desde los primeros años que sea relevante y conocida por los estudiantes. Al mismo tiempo, en esta diapositiva es importante considerar que en general los estudiantes que tuvieron o que habían tenido experiencias remotas también tuvieron una mejor experiencia de aprendizaje en esta situación, ¿ya? En esta situación de emergencia. Por lo tanto, una propuesta o algo hacia donde la comunidad universitaria podría avanzar es continuar de alguna forma con este tipo de educación en línea, sobre todo en aquellas competencias y en aquellos contenidos que se consideren pertinentes. No es obviamente actualmente la recomendación que toda la educación superior pase a ser virtual, pero sí ubicar espacios específicos donde eventualmente este tipo de experiencias podrían seguir ocurriendo. De esta manera creemos que los estudiantes van a estar mejor preparados, sobre todo en un contexto de experiencia de aprendizaje contemporáneo, de aprendizaje a lo largo de toda la vida, ¿cierto? Donde es muy posible que en el futuro, o sea, más allá de su experiencia universitaria de pregrado, continúen teniendo experiencias híbridas o en línea, y por lo tanto haberlas tenido ya en el pregrado podría facilitar su ajuste a esas formas virtuales de aprendizaje que pudieran eventualmente tener en el futuro.
Y ya para ir cerrando, ¿no es cierto? Comentarles que también los resultados muestran que hay un efecto de la forma en que los estudiantes son evaluados en pandemia, ¿ya? Los estudiantes que son evaluados con tareas basadas en desempeño perciben mayor empatía por parte de sus docentes, reportan mayor interacción con ellos y participación, y usan más recursos digitales. En cambio, los estudiantes que son evaluados con pruebas de ítems cerrados presentan menor percepción de aprendizaje y además regulan más negativamente su estrés, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, la meta sería que la universidad tiene que empezar en utilizar prioritariamente tareas basadas en desempeño, que de alguna manera repliquen, ¿no es cierto?, como se propone en la evaluación auténtica, los contextos, pero también las tareas que se van a necesitar en el mundo laboral. Reflexionar también en torno al efecto backlash de las pruebas estandarizadas y contra el tiempo que se realizan en plataformas. La verdad es que los estudiantes, y esto se nota a nivel cualitativo para los que somos docentes, cada vez más están con una sensación de aberración frente a ese tipo de pruebas, ¿ya? Sobre todo esto de que no pueden retroceder, de que tuvieron muy malas experiencias, de que en algún minuto algo pasó que no les alcanzó el tiempo. Entonces la evaluación cada vez más va perdiendo esa visión de evaluación formativa con feedback que sirve para mejorar, y se convierte como una instancia donde el estudiante tiene que dar cuenta ahí de su aprendizaje como si fuera un proceso estático, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, también es importante evaluar cuáles son las condiciones que tienen nuestros docentes para diseñar, implementar y también corregir estas tareas basadas en desempeño, porque obviamente en pandemia los tiempos son menores, el cansancio fue mayor. Y también es muy importante, y esto lo muestra el modelo predictivo, ¿no es cierto?, que nosotros concluimos, es que tenemos variables claras que predicen la autorregulación en pandemia, como el aprendizaje estratégico, la orientación al proceso y el vigor, y que todas estas variables son entrenables y posibles de desarrollar a lo largo de la trayectoria de los estudiantes. Por lo tanto, la meta debería ser diseñar acompañamientos institucionales y específicos para cada disciplina que promueven este tipo de estrategias y la metacognición, ¿no es cierto? Y realizar clases con metodologías activas, ¿no es cierto?, donde los estudiantes sean los protagonistas, ¿no es cierto? Que eso va a permitir que pongan al servicio todas estas habilidades de aprendizaje estratégico, vigor, entre otras. Y esa ha sido nuestra presentación. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Daniela, gracias, Carlos, muchas gracias por su presentación y agradezco a todos los panelistas. Por favor, Daniela, ¿puedes dejar de presentar? Y vamos a empezar solo con una ronda de preguntas, para no dar el tiempo, porque estamos pasados 10 minutos de los tiempos habituales. Entonces quiero partir con una pregunta. Le quiero pedir a Royce, a Jacqueline, a Carol, Daniela y Carlos que puedan prender sus cámaras. Y así preguntarles algunas preguntas que el público ha puesto en el icono de preguntas y respuestas. Para Carol, ¿cómo es la motivación y compromiso de los estudiantes en actividades para monitorear y enjuiciar la calidad de sus respuestas? ¿Observas alguna diferencia por género, disciplina y de ciclo educativo, por ejemplo, alumnos de primeros años o de ciclos intermedios o finales de su formación académica?
Thank you for the question. I think it depends very much on what we expect of students when they come in. So I think Royce was talking about how do you get them to step up quickly with his air conditioning unit. So it's what you expect. If you greet them in like they're coming into the workplace for the first day, you get them to step up straight away. The only issue I would say, motivation is absolutely essential. But one thing maybe that hasn't come out, and I didn't put it across as probably I should have done as well, is that we're making generalizations. Students have very different self-regulation capacities. Actually, self-regulation can be developed, but actually not so much. It's elastic, plastic, but we have found that some students are actually far more flexible, and that's an inherent heuristic, that's innate. So you can teach people certain things, but we also found as well that students who regulate very well can be undone by strategies that are put in place to support them. They're actually better off with not doing quite a lot. You get this expertise reversal effect. So you need to understand the different ways in which students come in. We need to know, and you can predict a lot from point of entry, and there are things that you can do to adjust that. The pandemic that many people have talked about today, motivation was one of the biggest things that students have problems with. And obviously the online aspect, when we come up with figures around variations in how students self-regulate, it does depend on whether the environment let them in the first place, because that affects their engagement within it. And just because they're not engaged, it may not all be down to them. It may be down to how we've interacted with them in the first place. But also, if our expectations are low, they ain't going to step up. And if our assessment doesn't require them to do, I'll give you a test. Go into your own university and see how many courses you can pass with no knowledge. You actually become quite qualified, because you actually can get away without knowing much to pass quite a lot of independent things. That shouldn't be the case. So there's lots there. I'll stop because there might be other questions for other people.
Ok, muchas gracias, Carol, por tu respuesta. Ahora hay una pregunta acá en el chat para Royce. Dice, utiliza este enfoque de, comillas, arrojarlos al fondo sin criterios, es decir, como sin indicaciones, ¿cierto? ¿En todos los niveles de estudio o esto es más exitoso en alguno de ellos?
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Look, there are people in the US, in the UK, in London, who have tried that same approach with children at schools aged about 8 to 9. And first, the kids had done this enough in their class for them not to be embarrassed about like exhibits of the work that they'd done. And they simply talked about it quite frankly. And I listened to some of the conversations of the kids. It was really quite deep, really. They were pretty perceptive. It taught them to look very carefully at what they were shown and to comment about it in, I thought, pretty adult sort of ways. They had very good judgments. I think, well, my own experience with a little boy of 3.5, which I recounted to a conference in Edinburgh, was I asked this little boy, 3.5, whether he liked, which he preferred, which he liked best, by that way, to use kids' language, Sesame Street or Play School, which is, now Play School is a TV program for kids put on by our national broadcaster, and Sesame Street is the American one. Okay, so I asked him, which do you like best? And he said he liked them both. And I said, okay. So I waited a little bit and I said, Mummy said that tomorrow you could only watch one of those. Which one would it be? And he thought for a while and he said, Play School. I said, okay, so why do you like Play School better? He said, oh, I don't really know. Oh, there are stories. And I said, well, there are stories on Sesame Street too. And he said, yes, but they're all chopped up. And that's right, because Sesame Street has all of these little short bursts of just a few seconds each, and the stories are there that you can keep the continuity going. But he said, when Mr. Music Man, who's one of the characters on the Play School, when Mr. Music Man plays the story music, I like to sit down and watch Louise turn the pages over and read the story. I really like that. So you think, okay, so he's 3.5, and yet he's been able to make a judgment and actually explain why he prefers one over the other. Now, that's a pretty simple case, but it's a young kid. And I think really we do our kids a lot of, as kids at school and also our university students, a disservice by being, I have to be careful how I say this, too student-oriented. I think we have to always be there to support them, but actually to toss them into some more complicated things, more complex things early on, so they learn to think differently. I think there's a sense in which a lot of feedback is sort of spoon feeding too much. And I know that I'm speaking against a lot of things that are very precious to lots of people, I know, but I've had a lot of it done in the name of scaffolding. And what I say is, yeah, but when a building is built, they take the scaffolding down and have a look at the building as a whole. They don't leave the scaffolding up. That's not what the architect wanted, unless it's very special scaffolding. But I think we can go too far. We're trying to be like student-centric. And I mean, I've always gotten well with my students. I've never really had criticisms, but one of the classes that I taught, like showing them stuff and getting them to make judgments all the time, their first reaction was, how could we do this? I said, why? And they said, because you're the teacher, you know all this stuff, we don't. I said, no, you're learning to be teachers, you better learn how to do this. And I'm just sort of saying, go and do it now. And they said, we haven't got any framework. I said, that's it. I said, you'll learn more by thinking hard and observing than you will if I give you a preset framework. And a lot of my thinking has been shaped by a person who used to teach anatomy in the UK, and she would give the students certain X-ray pictures and say to them, what is this telling you? Or what are the main differences between these? And the students would read into those a lot more of their knowledge of bone structure than what the pictures actually showed. And she had a lot of difficulty saying to the students, no, you must tell me what you see. Don't interpret it, just tell me what you see. And because she said, how do you get people to see what's worth noticing without telling them what to look for? She said, that's my biggest challenge in teaching anatomy. So I think there's, if it's approached the right way and you don't sort of make students embarrassed and put up with a big range of abilities to do things initially, my students anyway, they like the idea. And one student said to me, I learned more in this course than I have in the rest of my degree. So what about? And I said, just about what makes good stuff and what doesn't. So I'm not too negative about starting in the first year.
Gracias, Royce. Aquí aparecen algunos comentarios o Jacqueline y Carol quieren aportar, parece, a la discusión. Entonces le doy la palabra a Jacqueline y después a Carol.
Thanks. Yeah, I do agree with Royce about this, the amount of scaffolding, and I'm going to use a really specific example. We teach this advanced statistical methods unit in our honours course, and we do throw students kind of into the deep end, and their ability to sit with ambiguity is very minimum. They find it very hard, emotionally hard, I would say, that there isn't this paint by numbers, how do I get a high distinction on this course? And what we've really been focusing in on is telling them, we want to teach you the skill to work out what to do. We want you, we're making the task ambiguous because there's multiple ways to address it. Think about, the types of research analysis we do in our journal articles. There's several different ways to do the same problem, to tackle the same problem. So in our responses, when they want paint by numbers, we're spending time being like, okay, you don't know what to do. I'll tell you what I would do if I didn't know what to do. And we're trying to scaffold them learning how to self-regulate and work out for themselves, as opposed to giving them the answer, I mean. And I think what's really important is that has to happen earlier on. You know, we're finding it so challenging at that level because they're just not used to sitting with ambiguity. They're not used to being uncomfortable. They're not used to like not having some set of instructions that tells them how to get a HD. And we've got to work more on teaching the skills that underlie all of those things, that self-regulation, that they can work it out for themselves if they're in a job and there isn't somebody that's going to, you know, tell them step by step how to do something perfectly.
Gracias, Jacqueline. Carol?
Off move. Yeah, I was going to add to that, and I was just saying, in one of my many lives, of which I've had quite a few, I was a head teacher, and I would argue that 11-year-olds, and I've worked with 7-year-olds, 5-year-olds, are more confident than 18 and 19-year-olds. And is that a fault of our education system? Probably. So my question is that students arrive at university, they're very vulnerable. So I put a comment in the chat and said, we actually have to position them to be safe to be vulnerable, if that makes sense. So we have to name that actually this is uncomfortable, and we need to create the conditions for people to be willing to take those risks. I totally agree with that notion of what we have to, I mean, Dylan William, one of the gurus of school-based formative assessment, talked a lot about how actually the whole of formative assessment concept had been hijacked by schools because they target set for children for so many years that children cease to be able to set targets for themselves. And it's that same notion of over scaffolding for students, but it's basically, yes, daring them. So it's giving them the space to fail, giving them the space to find solutions for themselves rather than us doing it for them. But it's also scaffolding it for some more than others, but it is giving them that space before we jump in and feel that we need to solve it. So it's that combination, but it's creating the conditions for people to be willing to take the risks. And I think that's a massive challenge because a lot of students come into universities without that ability to do that. We know self-efficacy is one of the main things that affects how students do. And therefore, we have to manage that carefully. So we do need to do that, but we need to also manage it so that it works. So it's an interesting conundrum for us all, but one worth going to.
Muchas gracias, Carol. Ya se complementó completamente esta pregunta. Y tengo una para Jacqueline, que dice, ¿qué papel juega la persistencia en el aprendizaje autorregulado y qué estrategias pueden considerarse para favorecerla en el aula de clase?
Would you mind repeating that, please?
Yeah, I was going to say, can you repeat the question?
Ok. Voy a repetirla. ¿Qué rol juega la persistencia en el aprendizaje autorregulado? ¿Y qué estrategias pueden considerarse para favorecer este aprendizaje autorregulado y esta persistencia en el aula de clases, en la sala de clases?
Okay, got it. Royce, do you want to go or do you want me to go first?
I think one of the biggest motivators is when students experience success. And it may be that we find situations where they can experience real, not fake success. And that gives them a sense of, I can do this. I think that's to me a stronger motivator than trying to bring external conditions on them that we think are going to be motivational for them. And so I would try to look for ways in which students can do that. But when the students who I used to do this, to get in to read one another's work, and incidentally, I used to have my own work in the pile of stuff that used to circulate amongst the students, and it was not identified as mine. In fact, none of us, the students originally identified it with a key name. And then some students said, why do we do this for? Like, it's all baby stuff. We can take a hit on the head of somebody. And mine was in there too. And some of the students said to me, I'm amazed that you would be prepared to put your responses to this question out amongst us. And I said, well, like, if I can't do it well, there's something wrong. But I don't think mine necessarily is the best. Sometimes I come across a student one that is better than what I could do. And I think that's worth celebrating. So I think it's sort of just relating to them as just another person who's interested in their learning, and taking away any sense of exposure or making examples of people who don't do good stuff initially. I mean, I said to them, look, all of us start doing, like, when we start something new that's a task, we're always pretty weak at it, because that's why we're at university, to learn. I mean, you don't have a first-year student pulling teeth out if you're doing dentistry, but you might find them assisting. So we all start off low, and everything that I've learned, I've started from nothing, and everything you've learned started from nothing. Everything a carpenter knows, he started off hitting his thumb. This is just what learning is. Just get used to it. And most of them simply just accept that, and I don't think they feel any embarrassment. And I think then when they see a bit of success that they've achieved themselves, I think, oh well, I noticed that nobody else did, so I must be making some progress here. And they don't really compare themselves with others very well. They just go ahead and think, oh yeah, that was good. I enjoyed that. It was hard work, but I enjoyed it.
I suppose what I would add to that would be share it, which I think echoes what Royce has just said, sharing the rawness. I mean, I always show, I can show students my polished work, but if I show them what it started off at, and they see, or I show them research that has gone terribly wrong, it's very powerful. The other one, I'd go Japanese on this one and say, it's about goals and realistic goals. There is that lovely ikigai, if you're into that, which is not sweating the big stuff, but actually setting realistic goals that you can get. There's loads of research on this about not sweating the big stuff, but taking pleasure. There's loads of neuroscience on this about those that do better, those that take pleasure in achieving those steps towards things because it keeps them motivated. There's loads of work on that. The other one I would always say is, again, for the brave-hearted, but it works, is where you can train students to use the criteria to generate what they want to be assessed on, and they pitch that, and that they have to own it, and every moment of it, of the assessment, which keeps them motivated because they've designed it, they've co-authored it, it's their baby. But that comes back into what are the types of assessments we're setting, and do they really switch students on, or do we switch them off, and are they the most valid in what they should be conducting themselves in? So for me, it's about those things. And yes, motivation, as I said, is massively important, but also motivation in defeat, and how to take that knock on, and being prepared to drop something and restart, I think, is one of the hardest things for many students, because it's their baby, they want to take it forward, but knowing when actually you need to pivot completely differently and just walk away is not failure, it actually is success. So it's those kind of skill sets for me.
I guess I'll just add a point onto what Carol's saying, is not to just assume that everyone's goals are the same. I think we often think or talk like everybody wants to get a high distinction and get a perfect mark, and that's not everybody's goal. And so if your goal is different in learning, then that might be a different pathway. And also you might get demoralized by, someone sort of saying, well, you didn't get this other goal that they're not even interested in, So I think building confidence and self-efficacy and motivation is really important. And also just teaching students, something that I've noticed a lot during the pandemic is how to regulate negative emotions and spending time with them. I think it's just super important that they understand they might feel uncomfortable, they might have these negative emotions about their feedback or their assessment or their progress, and helping them to work through it, and that will actually help them to increase motivation as well.
I used to do exhibition photography, and I actually worked in a shop that run by a pretty good photographer, and I showed him some of my work, and he just shook his head. And I said, "So what should I do? Join a camera club?" He said, "No. All they do is talk about cameras and film." He said, "What you got to do is start submitting to international exhibitions and be prepared to take a hit on the chin for a couple of years." And eventually I won the top level in one of the Australian exhibitions. But that was just because I think, okay, so what does this really good stuff look like? And I had to sort of work that out. And I thought that was good advice. Like, go for broke if that's what you want to do, but just be prepared for knockbacks. Okay. Whoever is doing that brilliant work started where I am now. So I just happen to be younger. That's all.
Gracias a cada uno por su respuesta. Tengo una última pregunta para Daniel y Carlos, y también obviamente pueden complementar el resto del panel. La educación remota, en la educación remota, los docentes han reportado baja participación de los estudiantes. Mantienen sus cámaras apagadas y se muestran algo desanimados, desmotivados con las clases online. Pensando en la presentación de ustedes, ¿cómo recomendarían poder activar la fase de disposición de los estudiantes para que estén más activos e interesados en aprender?
Carlos, ¿quieres comenzar tú o comentar?
Vale.
Bueno, hay algo que la verdad yo creo que recién estamos empezando a entenderlo, pero que tiene que ver con prender la cámara o prender el micrófono y hablar o escribir en el chat, ¿ya? Sobre todo porque nuestros estudiantes no era la forma de interacción en la que ellos estaban de alguna manera acostumbrados, ¿ya? Y en ese sentido, pienso que es muy importante que lo primero tiene que venir de un trabajo del profesor, ¿ya? Y que es que no hay que vincular engagement con prender la cámara, por ejemplo, o participación con prender el micrófono, ¿ya? Porque en el fondo esas creencias del profesor muchas veces lo que hacen, ¿no es cierto?, es que modelan y hacen que el profesor dé ciertos diálogos y ciertos discursos que finalmente terminan por desincentivar a los estudiantes, ¿ya? Por ejemplo, cosas como no pueden escribir en el chat, solo tienen que prender el micrófono y hablar, por ejemplo. O si es que tú quieres hablar o hacer una pregunta, tienes que prender la cámara. Y hay temas que van mucho más allá del aprendizaje, como por ejemplo el tema de la intimidad, de si tú muestras, por ejemplo, dónde están. Hay estudiantes que no tienen privacidad, que están compartiendo la mesa donde se almuerza con la mamá que estaba trabajando al otro lado y el hermano que va al jardín que está pintando, ¿ya? Entonces yo pienso que eso generó mucha tensión, por lo menos desde lo que a mí me tocó ver en mi experiencia docente entre profesores y estudiantes. Entonces, primero me gustaría despejar eso, ¿ya? Porque el engagement y la motivación, etcétera, no necesariamente se demuestra porque el estudiante prende la cámara o habla, ¿ya? Y ahora, pensando en que el profesor de alguna manera es el que puede promover la autorregulación, muchas veces a través de su práctica, y como apareció acá el concepto de andamiaje, ¿no es cierto?, que los autores anglosajones le llaman scaffolding. Uno es muy importante que el profesor, de alguna manera, dedique tiempo, ¿no es cierto?, uno, a empatizar con los estudiantes, preguntarles cómo están, Pero también algo importante que aparece en la literatura de la educación online antes de la pandemia es un concepto que se llama presencia docente, ¿ya? Y una de las cosas que se pierde en la educación online en pandemia es la presencia del profesor. Porque muchas veces, muchos de nuestros profesores, ¿no es cierto?, hicieron clases más centradas en el docente, clases con un PowerPoint donde era el profesor el que hablaba y los estudiantes escuchaban, ¿ya? Y en el fondo eso obviamente impide que los estudiantes se sientan comprometidos, sientan que se les está entendiendo e incluso empiezan a sentir por qué nos hacen clases sincrónicas de esta manera, si perfectamente podría ser asincrónico, y en el fondo yo después veo el video en el momento que yo quiero de manera flexible, ¿ya? Entonces algo muy importante es que el profesor dé esos espacios, que idealmente también dé espacios para también que se genere presencia social entre los compañeros, por ejemplo a través de trabajos de grupo, ¿ya? Y también, en el fondo, que regule tanto trabajo de grupo, porque también esa fue otra cosa que pasó que desmotivaba a los estudiantes hacia la autorregulación, esta sensación de que todo era en grupo y que cuando nos juntábamos, cómo lo hacíamos, porque también era un proceso para adaptarse. Entonces es muy importante que el profesor se preocupe de empatizar con sus estudiantes, que genere espacios de presencia docente, que genere espacios de presencia social, ¿no es cierto? Y entender el engagement, entender la motivación de una nueva manera, ¿no es cierto?, distinta a como la entendíamos cuando estábamos en la clase presencial.
Solo brevemente para complementar en honor al tiempo, creo que es muy importante, como decía Daniela, respetar la intimidad de los estudiantes, porque muchas veces que los estudiantes no prendan la cámara no tiene que ver con que no quieran hacerlo, sino que es precisamente porque tal vez no están en los espacios apropiados o incluso tienen problemas de conexión. Recordemos que en el caso de Chile hay muchas personas que se conectaban desde zonas donde no había internet o donde no había buena calidad de internet, y por lo tanto en muchos casos también este tema de no prender las cámaras tenía que ver con no gastar el ancho de banda de alguna manera. Entonces eso yo creo que en primer lugar es muy importante. Y lo otro también, reafirmando lo que dice Daniela, es que lo que hemos visto es que las clases de los profesores han estado muy enfocadas en presentaciones, o sea, en clases tradicionales, digamos, el profesor con el PowerPoint habitual, y no se han generalizadamente ocupado otras posibilidades que entregan estas plataformas, como tener feedback de los estudiantes a través de algún tipo de sistema de encuesta en línea, del trabajo de los grupos pequeños, o ocupar otras formas de trabajo colaborativo como Padlet, etcétera, que también están a la mano y que pueden ser usadas, digamos. Entonces yo creo que esos elementos son importantes de considerar si se quiere tener un mayor compromiso, mayor presencia de los estudiantes en las clases online.
Muchas gracias. No sé si alguien más quiere complementar. ¿No? Bien. Quiero agradecerles profundamente la participación hoy día, tanto a las panelistas como a los resistentes asistentes que aún quedan en línea en estos momentos después de varias horas en conjunto. Así que agradezco a Carol, Royce, Jacqueline, Daniela, Carlos, porque realmente fue una jornada de mucho aprendizaje. Yo he aprendido mucho en esta sesión y espero que todos los asistentes también así sea. Así que nos vemos mañana en el cuarto panel. Mañana tenemos un panel titulado Colaboración, Cooperación, Aprendizaje de Pares para enfrentar nuevos tiempos. Así que va a ser en el mismo horario de hoy día, a las 16:20. Así que espero que sea una buena instancia para seguir aprendiendo.